Did the mayor know? What about the police commissioner?
These are questions for the mayor and the police commissioner.
When it's such issues of crime and safety, the Royce administration is simply bankrupt.
You still gonna announce for mayor next month?
I'm just gonna wait. Standing here today looking at this, I can't see how I can do anything else but put it out there right now.
All I can tell you is that for more than 4 weeks now, the Baltimore Police Department surrendered portions of the police district to the drug trade, and the council was not informed.
Fuck me. I fucking had this story all to myself a week ago.
Alex Cottrell and Toby Huntingford present Caught on the Wire. This podcast is an episode-by-episode analysis of HBO's widely acclaimed TV series about the city of Baltimore, its people, and its many problems. Find more information about the show and all the episodes online at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com.
Hello there, this is Toby. You're listening to Caught on the Wire, Season 3, Episode 12, Mission Accomplished. We're here right at the end of Season 3. I'm with Alex as always, and I think, am I right, Alex, pretty much our 1 year anniversary episode?
It is, pretty much bang on. Because I was partially reminded by the anniversary reminder from WordPress because of the website, because obviously I created it pretty much right when we started to. So it sent us a little message saying happy 1 year anniversary on WordPress. So I was like, oh, it must be a year in the podcast. And it was August. So yeah, it really has been that long.
That's crazy. And look at us, we've just managed 3 of the seasons. So it's pretty good progress as far as I'm concerned, I guess.
Yeah, I seem to recall saying back in the very first episode that, well, we'd probably be done in 2016 or something. Like deep into that, so...
Oh yeah, it's definitely going to be deep into 16, because we started season 1 around this time and finished it for Christmas, didn't we? So you can imagine season 4 will take the same course, and by this time next year we'll have to wonder what we're going to do, because time's going to run out. But yeah, it's crazy actually, really, isn't it, that we've run a full year of it, and it's really grown over that time.
Yeah, amazing. It's entirely beyond anything that I had expected.
Definitely. And the best way we celebrate that growth is with the Listener's Corner. And judging by how much stuff we have to get through this episode, I don't know about you, but it was an unbelievably busy episode. So we might as well jump straight into the Listener's Corner.
Yeah.
And hear what's been said. We do apologise about the lack of episode last week. It was a little bit unanticipated, but generally sort of busy conditions during summer. It couldn't quite be sort of fit in, but we are here today and we're ready for a really long, epic finale episode.
Yes, it's there's been a couple of little bits that have happened whilst we've been away as well. I think you may have seen on the website that I posted about the Fast Company article. Fast Company, if you don't know, they're like a online business magazine, and they did a article about definitive podcasts about pop culture, and there was about 19, 20 podcasts, and we were featured on it, and this was like back in January, so I completely missed it. I only spotted it by accident, and yeah, so it was really very flattering to be included on that list that included a lot of really, really cool podcasts by experienced podcasters, so it was very flattering, and I almost completely missed it, so that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see that too. It had flown under my radar as well, and the author was very much going for kind of a new breed of podcasts, specifically about podcasters who go very in depth with certain art.
Yeah.
So people who are very keen to cover every possible corner of a certain sort of franchise or actor or artist. And I think ours probably certainly qualifies. We spend between 1 and 2 hours on each episode of this show, and we're certainly leaving no corner unturned. So it was really cool to kind of see that movement of podcasts was being noted, and it's certainly something that, it's certainly a more hardcore form of podcasting than what used to be the case.
Also, it may seem unrelated at first, but have you seen any of the news from the Gamescom event where Microsoft have been doing a lot of announcing of various Xbox One happenings. Don't know if you've seen much about that.
No.
There is.
Please don't tell me there's going to be a Wire game, is there?
Well, not in the strictest sense, no. Spiritually, maybe. There's Remedy. I'm sure you know them as a fan of the Max Payne series of games.
Yep.
So Remedy have come back after not making a game for quite some time. They're making a game called Quantum Break, and it's interesting because it's like a TV and video game hybrid. So game is going out alongside a live action show that's also in production, and the game will feature episodes that actually interact with the game based on the choices that players make. So that's a really, really heavy idea and pretty fascinating. And it's good that a company like Remedy, who has done a lot of that really interesting storytelling and has always been very, very based heavily around their narratives and how they spin them off. And like with Max Payne, they have all the graphic novels, and they're really interesting. And it's a very unique style of game. It's good that they're harnessing that here in a very current way, because TV is TV long form TV episodes and are obviously really, really popular right now, and there's just series after series coming out and more than enough ways to see them. Why not add to that in a very overarching way by incorporating TV into video games? I know a lot of people have complained about Microsoft's approach with the Xbox and making it seem more like a device in which to watch films and TV rather than play games on. But here they're actually kind of committing to both sides in a very interesting way, so it'd be nice to see how this turns out. And the other reason I thought I would bring it up is because the game/TV show's cast of actors includes Lance Reddick and Aidan Gillen.
Oh, right, okay.
So, Daniels and Carcetti.
Hopefully it'll be the first game since LA Noire to use that amazing facial technology.
Quite possibly.
Yeah, because that's certainly something that would bring gaming into that TV sphere, I guess, if you wanted to do that. It'll bring it a lot closer. Absolutely. But yeah, no, that sounds really, really interesting. And when you say it's a TV show, it's not like it's going to air. It's going to be more of a on-demand Netflix-style TV show, right? And I assume you'll have to watch it only if you're playing the game and vice versa. There won't be a way to watch it independently.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how it's going to work at the moment, but it's an interesting idea. There's going to be some kind of episodes made available either as part of the game that are created in conjunction with people playing it, or I guess maybe it's going to be like the days of FMV. Maybe that's what they do. I mean, I remember playing... was it Tiberian Sun? It had James Earl Jones in the FMV sequences. Like he played like a general in it, and it was like, shit, James Earl Jones is like in a video game sort of FMV sequence. Like,
yeah,
there used to be a
few
big
big names that have popped up over the years.
So maybe that's what it's going to be. Yeah. Maybe it's like this returning of an old style rather than having, animated cutscenes. It's actually they're like little mini films in between the game. I don't know. We'll see how it works. I mean, this day and age when graphics are as good as they are, you could probably get away with it.
No, definitely. I mean, hopefully it's good, because if it were to be live action in the TV show and then go back to graphic, CGI in the games, it might be a little bit jarring. But if they can do it really well, so that you don't really notice it, it could be really, really good. Absolutely.
So yeah, an interesting idea. Thought I'd mention that.
No, definitely. It's that does sound good, and there's only a few things these days that will get me excited about games. I used to love games, and I still play all the GTAs as they come out. Not that they come out very often, but that's kind of the only thing I get excited about these days. But I'm certainly going to be looking into that, because that does look very, very, very cool. And I was a big fan of the Max Payne games.
I'm not having any trouble getting excited about games. Don't worry about me. I'm okay. I'm always excited. This November is nuts. There's some incredible stuff coming out in November this year.
Okay.
But I won't go into that. I won't go into it, because otherwise we'll be here.
All right. Well, we can always do a little bonus section, I guess, if you want. But for now...
Yeah, let's take a look at Listener's Corner.
Let's stick with our listeners.
There's some mail piling up.
I guess it's worth mentioning that the majority of our mailbox is YouTube notifications, courtesy of a certain Kevin Moore, who I think must be winning the award for the fastest ever podcast listener, who seems to have blitzed through our entire back catalogue and is almost starting season 3 by the looks of his progress. And every single time he leaves us a comment or some sort of really profound and interesting comment about each episode, which is great, bringing some life to our YouTube account. And if you do want to see what Kevin's got to say, do go and have a look at our videos and scroll down to the comments. There should be one for each episode at least, I think. And so we're very, very thankful for Kevin to getting involved with our podcast on the YouTube side.
I think we could just go through the entire podcast again just to look at each one of those comments. Like they're all very in depth. It's great. I mean, definitely recommend you go and have a look and have a read of them. And I think once he catches up with us, which I'm sure he will very soon, judging by his current speed, then we can start to address them more directly in the episodes. But it would be nice to go through each one, really. But we won't have enough time to go through all of it and give it the attention it deserves.
No. In terms of other emails, though, Damon, one of our long-time listeners, has gotten back in touch. He wants our takes on a couple of things from recent events and episodes. So, last episode we had the line between Stringer and Shamrock. When Shamrock says, "Them two hitters you asked after, they good with it." Stringer says, "Not on the phone." And Damon says, first of all, why was this such a score for the detail? All he did was say "not on the phone." And what do you think Shamrock is referring to? Does that line imply that Stringer went ahead anyway and tried to organise the Clay Davis hit? Like the two hitters were music, he should go on with the desired hit on Clay.
Music?
It's something that Damon's... Sorry, I have to
they
take
were
that
music,
back.
apparently.
Music to Clay's ears. No, it was music to the details ears, but it was that the two hitters were muscle. And he should go on with the desired hit on Clay. That's essentially what Damon thinks is being said there through slang. And it's always something that he's not quite been able to pinpoint. I've heard various opinions on it over the years and wondering what yours are. So I don't know if you have any points to say on that, Alex?
Yeah, it's not immediately obvious. I mean, it could mean something like muscle. Obviously, he's been having a deal with muscle recently. He's obviously not had these bodyguards or whatever that he doesn't want to have. Now he's organising something for himself personally, seeing as he's been cut out of what was going on with the actual Avon and his crew and the actual Barksdale organisation. So maybe he was arranging for his own bodyguards at some point.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
But I guess
Definitely.
because the reason why... I can't say for certain, but I guess the reason why it was a success for the detail is because they already had a lot of information that had a very strong sense that he was involved in something, but they couldn't quite prove conspiracy. And because they had him on a phone saying "not on the phone," I guess that may have been enough to say that may have been enough to tip the legal imbalance in the favour of saying he's involved in something, so it warrants investigation on. I don't really understand the legal system enough to really make an educated guess, but I'm guessing it's something to do with its proof of conspiracy. If there's sort of subjects you don't want to discuss on the phone, and you're already a person of interest who's being tapped by telecommunications intercepts, then I guess that's pretty incriminating if you don't want to talk on the phone about certain things when you're involved in that kind of crew.
Yeah,
They've got more than enough photos of him in pretty incriminating places and shady deals and whatnot, despite how careful he can be.
Definitely, yeah, I agree with you. I think if he weren't not to say "not on the phone" at the end, it wouldn't really have been anything. But as we saw with Freeman in season 1, I think I did mention last week, there was that scene with Prez that sticks in the mind about how he taught Prez how to identify conspiracy, even if there's nothing explicitly conspiratorial being discussed.
Yeah.
So whenever there's an attempt to put something under the rug, that's all valuable evidence that builds up towards whatever the actual thing is. So that's certainly what I took from it, just kind of building from the lessons it taught us before. And as far as the hitters go, I mean, the hitters to me sounds pretty ominous. Sounds like hitmen. I don't know if Stringer was perhaps trying to arrange some independent hitmen behind the Barksdale's backs in light of what happened recently with Clay, or with his money running away. I'm not too sure. That perhaps seems a little bit extreme, but that could always be an element to it.
I mean, it could be slang for so many things, couldn't it? It almost doesn't really matter what the two hitters are.
Yeah.
It's the fact that it is, like you say, quite ominous sounding, and also, there's not many, given what they know about these people and their organisation, there's not many things that could be and be innocent,
Yeah.
It's very highly suggestible phrasing, I guess. I mean, like I say, I don't know the ins and outs of it legally, but
if Stringer were in the baseball business, it might make more sense on the legit side of things, but I don't think it would work this time around, no. So,
maybe that's what they call staplers, his photocopying business. They're just hitting, and they're just hitters for some reason, I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they certainly hit
you could just come up with it for anything, I guess, but I don't know. Not sure.
Slang be slang.
But as for why it was a success, like we were saying, I guess it's just based on what we've been taught, like you say, on identifying where things are being withheld and how, as you gather information, as you both understand what it is that you've gathered and both what has been withheld from you, and you've known that they've tried to withhold it from you, then it's pretty incriminating, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure Stringer knows that to an extent as well, and it must have been just a very casual slip, which completely stumped him. Not that he knows about that since he ended up dead, but, all the pieces matter. So, okay, so there's our discussion for you, Damon, and that's our takes on those lines. There's certainly, you couldn't call it a slam dunk, could you, that getting him saying not on the phone? It's not a real hard piece of evidence, but it certainly was enough. And there's our take. We also heard from Dan, who's enjoying the podcast and has caught up fully. He's just listened to episode 11 of season 3 and wanted to chime in about the idea of Brother Mouzone being a mythical character in Omar's imagination. He thinks it's probably a difficult one when you consider the people he had interactions with, including Cheese, Stringer in the hospital, Avon, etc., etc. Also absolutely loves the opening scene of the episode. In fact, it's one of his favourites in the whole show, this being the one between Mouzone and Omar in their Mexican-style standoff. He can see what we mean about it being over the top, but I think the comical scene stems from the two egos of those involved. Both are kind of living on the periphery, both have huge names and reputations, and it felt like they knew that. Kind of like children who would argue, my dad is bigger than your dad. It felt like they were stamping their authority as the outlaw, the one who is so adept at living on the periphery, and in the end they formed an unlikely alliance based on their shared ethics of the game and desire to exact revenge on Mr. Bell. So I think that's a very, very adept understanding of that scene, really. Absolutely. And I couldn't really argue with that myself.
Yeah, I guess I should clarify as well, this is a different Dan to the Dan who is also a composer. This is a different Dan
Williamson.
Dan Williamson,
okay.
Not Dan Weismar. I was going to say Dan W, but they're both Dan Ws.
Both Dan W.
So, yeah, this is perfectly good reading of it. Really, it doesn't really suit me personally because I find it a little bit jarring compared to the rest of the tone, but it definitely works to have it at the beginning like that.
Yeah,
and I guess The Wire knows what it's doing with these scenes. It knows what it's trying to create, and it knows the kind of characters that they are. And it is a little bit, I don't know, they're always a little bit indulgent, these scenes. Quite a lot of the scenes with Omar can be a little bit like that, but they are still really good and they're very entertaining. So if that appeals to your taste and you kind of like that and it doesn't feel jarring to you, then great. I totally understand why people like those scenes.
Yeah,
and also it ties into what we were talking about George Pelecanos and how much he loves westerns and how much that showed in that episode. It was kind of like a standoff, wasn't it? Like,
oh yeah, it had all the cliches there, really.
And they're like talking about their guns and stuff. So.
Just having a little comparison session, making sure that each one lines the other better than the other. So it's all great stuff. And yeah, as I say, I mean, I can't argue with Dan's interpretation of it. In terms of its placement in the wider show, it is jarring. But yeah, echoing you, put it before the credits and it doesn't really stick out too much. And it is very memorable. I mean, you certainly can't argue that. So...
And as for the Brother Mouzone thing, I mean, that was just a silly idea anyway.
From the start?
Well, I mean, I said originally that you'd have to change the script quite a bit, but it would be kind of funny if he was. I just think that would be one of those sort of fan theories that you'd see if it were the case.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean,
but it's out there. I get that.
There could be some sort of shared dream between because he doesn't meet many characters. I mean, he meets.
Now, shared dream is just too much. That's too much. It's not heroes.
Well, it's not too far removed from the craziness of Mouzone himself, but yeah, that would be the only plausible way of doing it, and I don't think that's what Mr. Simon had in mind.
But yeah, that's some good comments definitely. So thanks for that, Dan.
Yeah, and finally we'll hear from Jarrett, who loves the show, and it finds it great hearing people talk about his favourite show on a weekly basis, or most times weekly, which is very true.
You got us.
Can't argue with that. You got us, man.
You caught us
here's the question.
red-handed.
Caught on that wire. Yeah, we will try our best to keep it going, but the summer can be a very busy time, and by this time next year we will have finished the show. How about that? So it's another year of guaranteed entertainment if you want it. So here's the question. Avon was sentenced to a very long sentence, he'd assume. It was 7 years. So why isn't he in prison with Weebay in season 4 or 5? Thank you, gentlemen, and keep up the good work. So we do see Avon in season 5. He comes for almost a cameo-style appearance, practically to hand over the crown to Marlo, who wants to buy the connect with the Greek. And we don't see Weebay. I mean, we see Weebay in season 4. We see Weebay at the end of season 5 with Chris Partlow, as they both move into prison. But it's true that Avon is never seen with those people. He's only seen with Sergei, actually.
Yeah, because he oversees a meeting between Sergei and Marlo.
That's right, yeah. So his prison association character is Sergei. I would have thought they're all at Jessup. Jessup seems to be the main prison referred to. Maybe they weren't. I guess it could well have been to do with actor availability. If you're going to write Avon out the show and bring him back for a few appearances, I guess it might be quite tricky to get Wood Harris back in the room, possibly, if he's not dedicated to the whole season. That's certainly just a bit of speculation on my part, but yeah, I mean, it is odd to think why they didn't include him, particularly in that final montage. He would have really completed that prison scene where Weebay and Chris kind of have this sort of look of affirmation for one another at the end. Yeah.
So yeah, that's it. Yeah, we do see Avon very briefly, but yeah, he's kind of just dropped from it, I guess. So just appears later on.
His story certainly finishes, yeah. All right. Okay, so that was Listener's Corner this week. Please keep sending your emails in. We will be back next week. I assume, is that right, Alex? You'll be around next week.
Yeah. Start season 4.
Excellent. All right. So we'll kick season 4 off straight away.
We haven't done this episode yet. So.
First of all, we better not get ahead of ourselves, and I'll pass over to Alex for our recap.
Okay, let's get going with the politics. So Carcetti discusses Colvin's Hamsterdam project with his campaign manager, D'Agostino. Carcetti wonders if Colvin's initiative is a step in the right direction. D'Agostino wants Carcetti to consider how his knowledge can help them win in the upcoming mayoral race. Carcetti believes that Royce is holding off on shutting down the Amsterdam zones so that he can first concoct a story claiming that it was part of an enforcement strategy. Meanwhile, Royce himself meets with a public health academic and his state attorney, Stephen Demper. He continues to pursue the idea of continuing the Hamsterdam project under a banner other than drug legalization. His Chief of Staff, Coleman Parker, walks out of the meeting to show his disgust. So we have Carcetti discussing Amsterdam with D'Agostino, and she's trying to steer him in that direction of, rather than constantly trying to do maybe what's right, because clearly he thinks that it's a good idea. It's this idea of, should we do what's right all of the time? She's saying that he can do what he may think is the right thing however much he likes, but he needs to take the steps in order to capitalise on the political point scoring that's going to get him into the position where he can actually affect change in that way.
Yeah.
And he's having to come to terms with that, and as we see later on, he does take that route.
And that's a very good point. And you can kind of see Carcetti's real noble intentions here being a bit tainted. And you can see himself making the rationalization process. He's telling himself that he'll compromise his principles for now so he can get in office, but then he'll, revert back to being an honest politician. And we all know that won't be happening. And it's kind of nice how they intersperse Carcetti scenes with Royce's, just to show kind of the two ends of the chronological spectrum with regards to being the mayor, and like having these good, really high ambitions, followed by really having to wade your way through the politics and avoid the issues completely. So it's quite painful to see in many ways. And really, D'Agostino, there's really echoes of that. You remember the Steintorf character, who I think mainly focuses on season 5. He's that devil on Carcetti's shoulder who really keeps him doing everything that's politically expedient and sort of staying away from things that actually help the city. And we even see it at this point. D'Agostino is there to really ward Carcetti on that line.
Yeah, it's what's very cutting about these two scenes together is how we have these two sort of key figures, Royce and Carcetti, and both of them individually have very good intentions, and they both kind of want what might actually cause a positive change to communities. And then, like you say, all of this politics in the way is it's just quite sad to see that this is what's stopping the actual change from happening, because individually these persons of interest have the idea that could make the change, but neither of them can, just because of all the bureaucracy and the point scoring and what actually gets people into positions of power. And it's what ties into this cyclical nature that the show is always trying to present, that no matter how much things can change, the way that it works, the game, as it were, the game doesn't change. And the game exists on the street, it exists in politics, it exists in all of these institutions. It's just tying into that idea that the show is regularly touting as part of its main themes.
Yeah, definitely. And that frustration is brought about through D'Agostino and Coleman Parker, who's Royce's advisor. And I think particularly in the case of Coleman, it almost feels like they're doing a bad job for these mayors, or these wannabe mayors. And but at the same time, you have to think about, if you're paying someone to help you win an election and keep you politically secure, that's what they're going to do, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to carry on doing it, and that's where their source of income will come from. So what motivation have they really got to entertain those perhaps more noble, more self-sacrificing sides of politics? There really isn't, and it totally makes sense why this is happening. So yeah, two scenes that really intelligently explore those issues and are able to see things from both sides.
It also emphasises the thin line, or the very mysterious, ambiguous area in which someone goes from being morally questionable to simply being, I don't know, not doing something or supporting something morally questionable, but avoiding that role, avoiding the kind of necessity of there being a moral question, and just doing what is pragmatic for the sake of politics.
Yeah. The idea of the conscience costing, you need to remove yourself from that idea and forget about it.
And as these people get pushed up the chain and appear in higher and higher station and still have this character, and perhaps it is strengthened within them, because the higher they get, the further they can fall, so they need to be more ruthless or whatever. It shows how thin the line is between each stage, and you start going around and appointing these figures as being evil or whatever. That's just grossly oversimplifying the problem.
Yeah, definitely. So good to see that. A lot of parallels between those two scenes.
Yes.
As you mentioned, really good to see Royce actually really entertaining what Tommy is as well. Tommy's really entertaining the idea of backing up Colvin here and actually trying to make something of it. And it's just really painful to see like Coleman just really kind of barely stomaching this conversation. He's like trying to really like roll out the room for fear of political suicide. So yeah, a really cool bunch of politics scenes there.
So let's move on to homicide. Got two bits here, one much smaller one at the end, but we'll start with this big chunk here. We have Commissioner Rawls and Colonel Forster quizzing Detective Bunk Moreland about the murder of drug kingpin Stringer Bell. He reports that his colleagues Crutchfield and Massey are working the crime scene while Norris is travelling to the morgue to watch post-mortems. Rawls tells Bunk that Krawcheck is a major campaign contributor to the mayor and the politicians have already been checking up on him. Holly quizzes Krawcheck about his knowledge of Bell's narcotics crimes. Krawcheck states that the gunman he saw appeared to be a large black male with a big weapon. Bunk enters the building and asks the crime scene tech to rush the ballistics comparison, whilst McNulty and Greggs watch the photographer work despondently. McNulty tells Bunk that he caught Stringer admits his disappointment at not being able to let Stringer know. Bunk gives McNulty cell phone chips that he found among Stringer's effects. Bunk tells McNulty that Landsman is preparing a warrant for Stringer's address. So we have our immediate kind of follow-up from the previous episode. They actually, this bit actually starts with a shot of the B&B billboard. It kind of brings us right back to where we ended the last episode.
Yeah, which is what the episode before did as well, when we cut straight from, I think, was it Muzone knocking out Dante to Omar coming straight down from the dark alley. I'm not sure if that was the same evening or not, but yeah, it's cool that this is practically a scene for scene resuming. Yeah, definitely. And seeing Bunk for the first time in ages as well. I don't think he's appeared for the last few episodes. And he comes back in a big way here, working the Stringer murder, mentioning Crutchfield and Massey as his assists, and made me think whether Massey, he referred to Caroline Massey, or whether perhaps Massey's husband works as a detective. I'm not too sure. But I've never heard that name used in the homicide before.
It's interesting as well that Forrester knows absolutely nothing of Stringer.
Yeah.
Like, he's supposed to kind of have an overview of what's going on in all these various departments, and we got this major case unit that's going after all these key figures, and he doesn't even know who they are. Like,
interesting as well that Forster's even out on site on the scene. Like, he's such a an office bureaucrat of a policeman from what we've seen of him so far, and the fact that he's out here means that a seriously important target is at risk, and it ain't Stringer. It's Krawcheck, who's on the back of the ambo. Rawls himself is worried sick. The mayor's worried sick. Last time this happened was perhaps when Kima got shot.
Not the money force it.
Yeah.
Not that goose.
So that's a really telling element of the scene. It's a much more senior crime scene than we're used to seeing. Everyone seems to have got their panties in a twist over it. And there was a similar element to this when there was a stray bullet in season 2. But I think the last time we really saw something a little bit like this was Kima's shooting, and that was perhaps a little bit more extreme as well. But it's definitely worth mentioning that Krawcheck brings home the big bacon from the police department.
Yeah, he certainly does, and they obviously get what Bunk describes as a very common statement from their people who have come under attack as just BNVG.
Yeah, it sounds like a real police Baltimore cliche thing that I'm sure has been drawn straight from Simon's observations on the force.
I can imagine it's a description that's been given plenty of times. Well, he was a big black guy and he had a big gun.
Yeah,
It's just kind of like in the moment. That's all. That's kind of, they're not thinking about it. They're just, adrenaline is rushing. They don't want to die. And when we see in Krawcheck's position, he is like absolutely sobbing and like absolutely hysterical. Like, he's not really in that situation. He's not capable of making an accurate description. So
yeah, definitely. So certainly a funny interlude with the BMBG. That felt very honest. And then we get to see the actual process of going through the crime scene. All the doors are now unlocked at this construction site.
Yeah, that's true.
And Bunk is working his way through, and there's one of the only mourners up there staring at Stringer's body. McNulty there in the corner.
Yeah, it's got a massive sulk on It's an absolutely
Yeah.
epic. This is one of the biggest sulks, I think. There are quite a few McNulty sulks, but this is a big one.
He's got to see that bottom coming up, and is this the bottom for McNulty? Probably is. And yeah, he really, really loses Freeman as if he lost one of his own kids, as Kima puts it later, and you certainly get that sense here. And you can kind of hear Freeman ringing in McNulty's ears at this point. How did you think this was all going to end? Playing on repeat almost. And this situation with Stringer dying as he did couldn't have demonstrated it better to McNulty, as far as, well, Karma demonstrating it to him anyway. And there's going to be a long mourning process in the same way that we see Avon doing it a few scenes later. They seem to be one of the few people that were really actually saddened by Stringer's death. So
yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Like, I guess they've developed this attachment over such a long period of time, especially for someone like McNulty who gets as involved as he does. So it does make sense here. We really do feel it with them.
I mean, he's not mourning Stringer; he's mourning his own ego, really, through Stringer.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't know.
Yeah, unlike Avon, who has some more genuine emotion behind that.
I suppose so, but I don't think it's as heartless as that, maybe. Because we do see that, despite everything, McNulty doesn't appear to, like, detest Stringer. He doesn't really kind of have this hatred for him or anything like that, as far as people can tell. Like, although he does kind of express frustration at injustices and whatnot, but when he's with him, he jokes with him, and so I don't know. I think maybe I'm being idealistic, but it doesn't seem like it's quite that mean. They're not just like, oh, my poor case or anything like that. I guess there is a very, very slight sense of like, this is what it comes to. This is how people die now. They die in this warehouse because they're selling drugs, and there's this whole complex thing going on they've just been trying to figure out. It's almost like it's too overwhelming to make it purely just about themselves, even though they are being quite selfish, and it is about him catching him. He does obviously admit to Bunk that he wishes he could have told him, but in that kind of scenario, it may just be quite overwhelming as well. I don't think it doesn't feel entirely malicious. It doesn't feel entirely self-centered.
Yeah.
Although it may appear that way, I feel like it could be more than that. And also for someone like Greg's as well, like she doesn't feel quite so hard on that as well. I think it's just a realization of what things have become when people are dying in this manner. And as McNulty finds out in the next section that we do, especially when he realizes how little he understood Stringer, he actually seems even more saddened by it then.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this realization of this is what it has become, rather than just, oh no, my case, I don't know. I thought it could be that way anyway.
I guess, like, beyond the case, it's also Stringer for him has represented his purpose in life practically for the past 2 years.
Yeah.
And without Stringer on the street, how else is he really going to be motivated to do anything constructive? And it's perhaps that sinking realization that he's going to have to find some stability, even if it is against his will. And of course, we see the results of that in the next few minutes, or over the course of the next hour. But I guess that could be a slightly more emotionally kind of legitimate element to it, rather than just it being about him and his ego. But yeah, I mean, should we move on to the bit where he goes to? Yeah,
there's just a small section here, really, and where Bunk and McNulty collect the warrant and search Stringer's home. McNulty gets a call from Colvin to arrange a meeting during this. Inside Bell's luxurious and tastefully decorated apartment, the pair examine the dead man's belongings. So yes, this is where McNulty kind of comes to realise that he didn't really know the person that he was chasing at all. He kind of picks that book out of the shelf, and I think it's The Wealth of Nations, or something like that.
Yeah.
So he just realises how little he kind of understands this person. And like you say, it represents a hell of a lot of his life. In some ways,
yeah.
A lot of his time spent in the past couple of years just shows how little he knows, despite all that work.
Yeah, and it shows him how much more work there was to do to really actually understand Stringer, and he could have spent time doing that. And here we go. It really is all at once. It's quite a big surprise, even for us, really. I mean, how much of a sort of an urban oasis he's made for himself up in this harbour apartment with his little fountain and his really, really well tidied desk and his very, very straightly arranged apartment.
Yeah.
So he's certainly living his dream, as he put it to Avon last week, as he believes that he has found the dream, and now he's just got to expand that dream. And yeah, so it's cool to see that, and it certainly feels like Stringer knows what he wants, and he did get that to some extent, even if he made quite a few mistakes along the way.
And going back to what I was saying before about it not being seen as entirely, his death being entirely self-centered, like for McNulty, I mean, I feel like his reaction here does demonstrate that it's not just the work that he's done and everything that's died. It's also that there was so much more to this person that he didn't know about, and that died as well. You know, I felt like his reaction here showed that, even if maybe it wasn't intentional, I don't know. I kind of read it that way at the time, so it made it feel like there was a bit more weight behind Stringer's death than just the death of the case. Yeah, and also as viewers, we understand, despite what you may think about Stringer, and he is still, incredibly clever and enjoyable character to watch. So it's, as with all of these deaths in The Wire, you always end up feeling conflicted no matter what. Yeah,
because particularly when we're asked to support the people who are trying to kill him actively and arrest him actively, it's very, very tricky. But it certainly is really good as kind of a way to act as an almost epigraph, just to see his actual apartment. We never saw any scenes of him returning to this after one of his, work sessions down at the funeral home. And as much as I'd like to have seen one, it's nice that they at least show us this little snapshot here, just so we get a sense of his real home life and his real sanctuary.
And we see it in the same way that they see it as well. Something that The Wire often does is that we'll withhold things like that so that we can experience it at the same time for the first time as the characters do.
Yeah, definitely. And that really works here in terms of the drama. Absolutely.
So that's Homicide. The Homicide-specific stuff, anyway.
Yeah, certainly.
So let's move on to the actual Barksdale organisation specifics. So Avon, obviously downcast over Stringer's death, refuses to talk to Shamrock at their funeral home base. Slim Charles arrives and is met by the angry soldiers of the organisation, and Bodie tells him that he is ready to go after Marlo Stanfield based on the assumption that he is responsible. Charles talks to Avon about Stringer's death, and Avon tells him that Stringer died for reasons beyond his control and that it had nothing to do with the Stanfield organisation. He confesses that he's lost interest in the war with Stanfield, but Slim Charles tells him that they must continue now that they've started it.
If it's a lie, then we fight on that lie.
Exactly. Yeah, this is obviously.
But we gotta fight.
Yeah, this is one of the most important phrases, not just in this episode, but I think it's a very important epigraph. I think we'll talk about it more later. But Slim has a very important role, especially in this scene, and he embodies a lot of what comes from that war on terror, war in Iraq analogy as well. About once you're in it, you're in it. They've come into this war and they can't just back out because they no longer feel like it. And it is interesting to see Avon's change of heart here as well. He kind of realises how much of a waste of time it was. It kind of took Stringer's death for him to realise that, and it's like it kind of makes the whole situation worse, really, because his the misunderstanding and the different opinions that he had with Stringer have now all evaporated. But now he's gone, and it's too late, and trapped within this war. So it's a very, very desperate situation for Avon, and Slim is playing an important role here by delivering these harsh truths. And being the person to stand up. And in that sense, like, throughout this whole process, it always feels like Slim Charles has been a better leader than anyone else, because he's always there to motivate people, and he gets shit done, and he's loyal, and he's one of those characters where you really don't have a bad word to say about him, despite the fact that he is a violent, gang member and drug dealer.
Yeah, he's just such a likable character, and he seems to dish out this wisdom to no end, doesn't he? And I don't know where it all comes from, but he's clearly had a very enriched education process. But it's a really, really good moment from Slim here. Just sort of, as you say, cuts through the emotion, gets to the reality of the situation, and puts it in a very Iraq War-esque comparison, certainly. Which is one of the things they've been trying to do an awful lot of this season. Yeah, and of course there's another element to this scene where we see what's going on downstairs in the funeral parlour, where everyone else is prepping for violence as a result of Stringer's death. There's this instant sort of symbolic knee-jerk reaction. Once Stringer's gone, the violence resurfaces entirely. All of Stringer's work that he's been trying to do is completely undone. Even Bodie, who's been subscribed to Stringer's economically minded drug dealing, is right back in the violent fold and down for avenging anything to do with Stringer. And of course we see that it's all being blamed on Marlo. It's the assumption being made all around. And they're using these other events to justify and blame those who they hate at the moment. So there's a lot going on, and there's this odd little sanctuary upstairs where Avon is just really taking his time to completely mourn Stringer, and I think, as you say, put into perspective what his life has been so far, and the fact that being part of this drug dealing gang where death is such a blasé thing to them, all of a sudden it's not anymore once you lose someone that really is close to you, and it's really making him re-examine things by the looks of it here.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a real difference in approach, and the haste in which people are entering violence, and the almost, reflective stance that Avon is taking, like you say, now that he's lost someone that actually matters in that sense.
Yeah,
in a way that was... obviously, he knows why it's happened as well. It's not like with D'Angelo where it happened, but he was none the wiser at the time. He just had to deal with that in that way. But with Stringer, he realises that his thirst for all the violence and the power that it brings, it actually brought about the death of his best friend.
Yeah.
So, and everyone downstairs, like you say, is just ready to jump right in it, because to them it's just another opportunity to pump chests and scream and yell and get angry and just raise hell.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a nice, interesting sort of conflict there going on at the funeral parlour. Yeah. Is that scene done? Is there anything more on that front?
No, that's it. That's kind of that bit for that section. We obviously revisit a lot of those bits again, but they'll come as part of our other sections. And we'll start with a big one here, which is our major case unit. So the first one, at the major case unit headquarters, Freeman and Greggs man the wiretaps and note that Stanfield is being blamed for Stringer's murder. Freeman anticipates an increase in the intensity of the war, and Greggs reports that McNulty has gone to search Stringer's home with Bunk. McNulty meets with Colvin and learns that he is on permanent leave. Colvin gives McNulty the location of Avon's wartime safe house, the tip he received from Stringer before his death. McNulty delivers the cell phone chips and other things from Stringer's home to his colleagues. Sidner observes that the cell phone chips explain why Stringer never used the disposable cell phones provided to the rest of the organisation. McNulty takes Freeman aside and tells him that Stringer gave up the tip about the Barksdale safe house, and Freeman realises that the tip was given to Colvin, as this explains Stringer's previous calls to the Western. Freeman then phones Daniels, who is at a public campaign event for his wife, and Marla at the same time is being watched on the TV in the major case unit by Sidner and Perlman. So this is there's quite a big section there, but this is like the setting up of our major case unit in this episode, starting with us seeing with them manning the wiretaps. They're obviously hearing the information that we've heard about Marlo being blamed for the murder. And obviously we hear about the other things that are going on with the other members that we've seen already. And I guess it gets a bit more, digs in a little bit more when we have McNulty seeing Colvin and him getting the chips there and explaining a little bit more about the cell phones. It's interesting that we have quite a typical McNulty and Freeman action here, where we have sort of McNulty refusing to tell, but Freeman figures it out anyway.
Yeah.
There's that bit where he does his sort of silly smile and he's like, I'm not going to tell you, I'm smarter than you, I figured it out. But Freeman just figures it out anyway. So
Colvin, call to the Western.
Yeah. so I really like that bit. It was a very kind of archetypal bit of it. And it felt very satisfying.
I'm pretty sure those moments were turned on the tables in a couple of episodes ago when it was the other way round and McNulty was doing the catch-up. So, Yeah, it's certainly a good moment. There's quite a few little mishmash of different moments in this scene, really, because we also had an interesting Pullman and Daniels bit, where she was sort of watching what was happening on the screen with Marla's sort of election speech going on, really, and
She's watching
Daniels
the
having to
show.
play. That's right, yeah, and no one else manages to see her reaction, but she's certainly feeling very, very, perhaps a bit betrayed by the fact that this is being televised in front of her. So, yeah, public kissing got to feel pretty damning. So that's certainly
Yeah, it must be
another
hard to
element
watch.
to it. Yeah, so it's good to see as well. And then, of course, we get more reiteration that Marlo is the blame here, and of course that the police are going to believe everything they hear. Or it doesn't even matter really. I mean, if that's who's getting the blame, that's who's getting the blame, and that's who's going to face the consequences for it. So it's good to see that. And I guess there's also the bit where McNulty goes to see Colvin, just very briefly, and Colvin gives him Avon's warehouse and comments that it's probably going to be the last piece of police work he ever does in a long historic career.
Yeah.
Which is true. So it's nice that he notes that bit, and it also turns out to be a damn good pull, as McNulty puts it later. So he did at least cause some good.
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely very fortunate of them to get hold of that from their point of view.
Yep.
So, yeah, like you say, quite a few little bits going on there, but that's like setting up our major case unit. Should we move on to the next bit?
Yeah.
So Bunk and McNulty spend the night drinking together, and Bunk notices that McNulty seems to be cutting back his alcohol intake. Bunk speculates that Omar was involved in Stringer's murder on the basis of the shotgun shells found at the scene. He believes that they will match the casings from the double homicide of Tank and Tosha. McNulty tells Bunk that it may have been Marlo rather than Omar, but Bunk worries that the murder rate is spiralling out of control. Bunk urges McNulty to drink more, but instead he takes Bunk home. And Cheryl phones McNulty to find out why Kima has not returned home, and he covers for her. So sort of harkening back to a more reckless McNulty here, especially as he steps onto the train tracks and he looks out across them mournfully, and we hear the train horn in the distance, but he walks away very early, and it was just kind of reminding of those earlier scenes where he was being so destructive and, you know, being so reckless purely for the sake of it, purely because it just made him feel good, wallowing in his own guilt and problems. But he takes a more responsible stance here, it's kind of to the extent where he's now covering for someone else. And we mentioned it. We remembered him telling the story back in Moral Midgetry, was it?
Yeah.
Where he was in that sort of motel with Greg's, and he's talking about how he used to get away with it, how he used to get someone to cover for him, and he pulls the same thing for Greg's, and that's why later on, or she says, you know, thanks for covering me.
Yeah, he's becoming the person who does the covering rather than the person who does the dirty.
So it's a real change here.
Yeah, definitely. And I like the fact that the train is standing still for once as well.
Yeah,
it's not far. It's got its light on. It's got its engine on by the sounds of it, but it's just sort of standing still. There's been a lot of debate over what the train metaphor really means. It's used a few times. I know Brother Muzone mentions it as well, the slow train coming. But obviously, Jimmy has put in self-defenses against his self-destruction now, really, and obviously the train isn't moving for that reason. And perhaps it's also sort of stopped at a station because there's a real transition here. Bunk's about to get a lot more work as the war ratchets up, more bodies to look into, and McNulty's about to lose a lot of work. He sort of lost his purpose. He knows Daniels will be kicking him out very soon.
Well, I guess that's why. If you're
do.
looking at why the train's stopping, that could be it. Because, like you say, he's lost a lot of work. So it was before things were hurtling towards him constantly, and he was facing them with this recklessness and this self-destruction. Now that has suddenly stopped, and this big weight has been ground to a halt, and he has time to reflect and to stand on those tracks. And rather than, urinating and almost dying, he's just reflecting. He just looks pensive for a bit. Doesn't really take any action. He doesn't feel the need to express anything there. It's a far more contemplative McNulty.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a lot of gravity to the line "I'm tired, Bunk."
Yeah,
like,
it's massive, isn't it?
There's something so big about it. Like, it's a real transition moment, and it's just him saying that everything I've done so far has been wrong. It's been bad for me, and I now want to take a stand against it.
And again, like I said, this is why I think that Stringer's death does have this impact in more than just the self-interest of it. It makes them realise. I mean, Bunk says, talking about the murderite spiraling out of control. Like, it's just such a big deal for Stringer to die in that manner that it really hits them. So we do see it here. Like, Bunk's obviously being very drunk, so he's kind of seeing it in a slightly different way. But yeah, you're right. Like, the way he says "I'm tired, Bunk" is just, it's like a huge sigh. Yeah.
And then, of course, it's responded in quite a fairly important way as well with "I need more," as screamed out by Bunk. I don't think, as far as I remember, Bunk doesn't really go off the rails more so than normal in season 4, but there's certainly an element that they're perhaps switching roles a tad, and these extra murders are gonna throw Bunk off the stress ladder, really.
Yeah.
So for one person, this death is leading them to wreck themselves, whereas with Jimmy, it's acted as a real turning point. So, again, good to see that. And there was also one other line that was mentioned when they talk about Marlo, and McNulty sort of calls him the heir apparent, which I really like the way he puts that. McNulty's very understanding of the way the city works, that there's always got to be someone new to come and take your place if you step down. But the game must continue. It doesn't matter who's playing the game, but it must continue. So that was quite a nice way of putting it.
Right, shall we move on to the third section for Major Case Unit?
Yeah.
So Freeman meets with Prez early in the morning at the park. He states that the Vanguard, which is the BPD's Association of African American Officers, has voted against him. Freeman urges Prez to fight the charge, but he tells Freeman that he's not meant to be a police. Freeman then arrives late for the unit meeting about the Barksdale safe house, and Daniels is reluctant to move against the safe house on the basis of an anonymous tip because he feels he doesn't have probable cause. McNulty becomes impatient, and knowing that Colvin will go along with it now that Stringer is dead, reveals that Stringer was the informant. Daniels orders the unit to continue to monitor the wiretaps, but also to prepare a warrant for the safe house. Sidney and Greggs begin surveillance of the safe house immediately.
Okay.
So starting with what is a very nice and a really, again, very, very quite almost like, dare I say, like tender scene with Prez and Lester.
Yeah.
And he's
We
saying...
haven't seen him in a while.
And when he says, like, failure to identify as a police officer, and that's kind of pretty much what he's been doing his whole career, like, I think that's a very heavy statement and somewhat true as well, and really feel it there. See how, obviously Freeman is a bit of a mentor to him, but they are good friends as well. They obviously have a lot of common, maybe people that otherwise wouldn't have found people on the same wavelength as them, and all of the work that they've done together has been really meaningful to what it may have been otherwise quite troubled careers. In the case of Prez, it's because he's never really felt like he's belonged, and because the whole police work, it wasn't really right for him. It was only once he managed to get involved with that wiretap, and how he said to Valchak, it was different. Something really came alive in him when he was doing that. And the same is true of Freeman, but in a slightly different way, because he had been more abandoned. He had been able to fit in to some extent, but because of the actions, he was obviously more like McNulty. He was more reckless. Ended up in a position where he was abandoned, but he found his way back in by obviously getting involved with the detail originally and now being part of the MCU. So these two characters who understand each other very well and what it's like to be in their scenario and to want to do that kind of police work and how it's affected them. And it's quite heartbreaking to see Prez like this, knowing how good he is at his job and how it's all come to this. And it is like a bit of a freak incident that causes it, but that is sometimes what happens.
Yeah, it's nice, and the scene conjures up a real image for me of how Prez got this job in the first place, and we can very much imagine getting married to, Valchek's daughter, and Valchek saying, I'll get you a nice spot because she's spot on the police force. Yeah. Doesn't really matter if you're qualified or whether it's good for you or not, but that's where you'll come. It's a very honourable job, and clearly it just doesn't work out. And it's as we see, Prez finds his forte in that investigative kind of logical paper trail policing. And as soon as he ever has to actually go back to doing any sort of beat policing, any physical aspects of policing, he completely crumbles, and he's just not built for it. And it's nice that he does. You know, it seems like quite an extreme, almost exaggerated line that he's been guilty of not identifying himself as a police officer his whole life, but in many ways it's true. Like he was, as much as he enjoyed those in-office moments, it was kind of, he was cheating himself of what the job really was in some ways. So yeah,
and he's really shared that with Lester as well.
Yeah,
and those two have obviously been, you know, working on those cases in a really close proximity for incredible amount of time. So
definitely, they've been such a close bunch. And another member of this episode who is really contemplating their next step, a real transition for them. Obviously, Marlo, Prez, McNulty, I think they're all in that category particularly strongly. And I think the scene ends with Freeman saying, you know, what do you want to do? And there's a good few seconds of contemplation as they stare out over the misty bay. And I love the fact that the actual transition to the next scene is we have a close-up on a sheet of paper with numbers on it.
Yeah.
Sort of announcing that this maths teacher comes along. And, you know, it's a great logical next step. He's good at doing the logic and all the phone-based puzzles of the criminals, but can't handle the physical side of it. And the maths teacher perhaps is one of the better choices for removing the stuff that he's not good at. And
we see a bit further on in season 4 as he gets involved with his computers as well. It's obviously something else he enjoyed as well. So yeah, it's a good progression. Another reformation. Yeah,
and it's nice how they do another transition with Freeman turning up with his coffee still warm after being a little bit late, seeing a friend. The detail really gives you a feeling of that cold morning, ready for the new day at work. So I thought that was quite a nice little detail anyway.
It's interesting that very little is put on this vote against him. It's not really clear what it is that they've voted on exactly. Was it like tick the box if you think he's a racist? Like, I'm not really sure exactly what it is that they voted on.
Yeah,
the kind of vote of no confidence of him as his duties as a police officer. If it's based on, is it like how much of it is based on what they think must be racial discrimination and what they think is just general negligence? Or I don't know. I mean, it sounds like a very maybe that's why they didn't go into it, because it just would have been too much to really explain accurately. I don't really know. Like it's kind of waved away in that sense, and I always thought about what was it exactly they were voting on.
It's odd, isn't it? I mean, it assumes that they all knew the facts, and no one knows the facts really. I mean, no one saw it. Not even Prez knows the facts, and I guess in that situation, the only way to deal with it is perhaps to have a vote. Do you think Prez's murder was racially motivated? Yes or no? And 6 out of 10 said yes. So I don't know. It seems a bit flimsy, doesn't it? But I guess there's not many other ways to deal with it in a way, and perhaps a satisfying way for the department.
So that's our that's that first bit there with Freeman and Prez, and then we move on to them preparing to actually move on the safe house itself based on the information that they got from Colvin. And obviously he reveals that it was Stringer that was the informant. And they're preparing a warrant for the safe house, and then we have Sidney and Greg's actually starting surveillance. So that's kind of them gearing up for the next bit, I guess.
Okay.
So on the wiretap, the unit records Slim Charles phoning in Stanfield's location. Charles has tracked him to Vincent's rim shop, and he orders his soldiers to prepare to strike against Stanfield. This prompts the unit to move against the safe house. Shamrock tells Avon about the opportunity and urges him to take part. Once Shamrock and Avon arrive at the safe house, Daniels confirms there are at least 10 suspects inside based on surveillance. He calls for backup before moving in, and instead of the tactical response unit, Daniels is met with Sergeant Carver's drug enforcement unit squad, as he tells them that the technical unit is too busy cleaning up the free zones to offer assistance.
Okay, so we have our big raid.
This isn't quite the raid. Well, this isn't the exact raid.
Is it not?
This is just
our
a bit
setup,
beforehand, because it includes a little bit of we see some Barksdale movements as well. So I just separated this a little bit here. Obviously, we see that Slim Charles has tracked down Marlo, and they're sort of getting so close to striking against him. It really is on the edge, on the wire, you might say. And they're obviously building up and getting ready to move in. It's interesting that the tactical response unit is obviously going around blasting around the free zones rather than actually going to attack what is, they're going around a load of places where all the junkies and whatnot have been. They're not really a threat in the same way, and there's certainly no violence sort of overtly going on because of the way that Hamsterdam has been working. And yet the supposed sort of tactical response team are nowhere to be seen when they actually need to raid a place that is full of bombs and grenades and people with big guns, and there's like sort of at least a dozen or nearly a dozen people who are heavily armed that they're going after, and they're actually nowhere to be seen. It's like a role reversal. The people who should be dealing with the actual drug bits are nowhere near where any of the drugs are, and the people who should be dealing with all the people with the weapons and the firearms are where all the drugs are instead. So it's like a sort of, they're in totally the wrong places.
It's a classic bureaucracy moment, sort of bureaucracy fail. But very good observation, and just ridiculous really. And we see that the replacements are Herc and Carver basically, who certainly enjoy a bit of violence,
but they're wearing yellow, so they mean business. They've got yellow sort of parkas on, so they mean business. Very, very strange. It's nice that they all get to come back together as an old detail for a last hurrah. Yeah, it does work quite nicely in that sense. Like you say, it's the final mission.
Final mission, but bring back the old crew, arrest Avon, the original target, for good. Make him do all of his 7. There's something a little bit poetic about it that's nice. It ties it up quite neatly, and it's nice that Herc and Avon being there isn't just kind of for the dramatic, just convenience of it. Yeah. And as you mentioned before, there's a big bureaucratic nightmare going on that really justifies their being there. So that was pretty cool.
And that moves us on to the actual raid itself. As we see, they end up not really needing much backup anyway, as Daniels orders his men to knock before entry, rightly believing that a frontal assault will be met with heavy resistance. Inside, Gerard reports to Avon that Stanfield is still at the rim shop, but his bodyguards have left him with minimal protection. As they talk, the raid begins, and Avon orders Perry not to shoot at the police and tells Gerard to let them in. Perry tries to claim that weapons are all his. McNulty tells Avon that he will serve the rest of his original sentence for the parole violation at the very least, and shows Avon the search warrant, carefully pointing out Stringer Bell as the source of the information. The arrested criminals are taken to the homicide department to be interviewed, and Freeman is greeted by Bunk and shows him and Greg's interviewing Shamrock. Poot, Squeak and Bernard are among those arrested on the basis of the wiretaps. And McNulty and Pullman interview Bodie, who claims entrapment because he was selling in the free zone. So we have our raid, and then we have the aftermath of our raid. We see how willing Perry is to sort of claims that all of the weapons are his.
Nope, it's mine.
It's just
mine. It's
very strange. A little bit late.
Yeah, so he's the wee bay of guns. Everything's falling on him.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see this loyalty that exists in this game, and that Avon, despite the fact that he's practically retired from the game, is completely insulated as far. Well, I mean, he's not, but the people are very, very well intentioned about that. And Perry, who is that big guy, he's been the main muscle, right, in the funeral home. He's always just been that sort of silent guy who's very, very memorable. He's finally doing a little bit more now. Taking ownership of all those weapons. So that was pretty cool to see. Nice to see Herc sort of not really doing much, but just touching all the weapons and enjoying them, and disarming the shotgun. He obviously seems to enjoy doing that. In fact, the very first time we see him in the show, in the pilot, he's disarming a shotgun in the same way. So he's certainly enjoying all the machinery.
And McNulty does get a bit involved with the whole arrest, and obviously does do a bit of gloating with pointing out the Stringer Bell's involvement and the source of information.
yeah, his next best win to telling Stringer about their findings is telling Avon, I guess, and
That's his
he
silver
certainly
medal.
yeah, that's his final stand. And I like the fact how Avon was sort of laughing. I mean, as soon as he realised that he'd been clocked, he was just sort of laughing. I don't know what the laughter quite meant. Whether he was just appreciating how well the game had been played against him, or just perhaps fairly accepting of the new arrest and doing the rest of the 7.
I guess sometimes all you can do is just laugh. It is one of those situations, isn't it, where he's just, despite everything, he's been bested. He's kind of he got himself in this situation, got involved in a war that he didn't really want to be in. And all these crazy things have happened in such a short space of time, and now he knows full well that he's going back to jail again, most likely for a very long time. So it's just one of those moments of madness, really, where all you can do is laugh. I guess there isn't really a why.
Yeah, it's certainly a bit more serious when he sees, I guess, metaphorically, Stringer reaching beyond the grave to slap him in the face as he reads that warrant.
Yeah, it's finally dragging him down. Yeah,
which in some ways may actually appease his conscience a little bit. Like, he knows that Stringer has also done him a bad one. But yeah, it's kind of a satisfying moment that both of them know that they turned each other in. Yeah, certainly. And everything happened at such critically timed moments this episode. As the crew is literally about to make their hit on Marlo, a very likely hit as well, considering the amount of protection he has at the rim shop. The Barksdales are arrested, leaving the actual crew to not give them the go-ahead to knock off Marlo. And Slim Charles actually makes the decision, because they haven't gotten the go-ahead, they're going to have to abandon and come back the next night. So they could have ended the war there and then.
Or so they think, anyway.
So they think. I reckon that. I mean, it may well have been a lot trickier than that, but I think they certainly set up Marlo as quite unguarded for that reason, to make it all the more frustrating. Yeah,
again, contributing, I should say, to Avon's laughter. Like, it's literally, they're just about to get this sorted, and they get stopped. So yeah, it's a very, very unlucky timing for them.
Yeah, ridiculous, isn't it, really? And I guess it's just worth mentioning for a final episode. This is practically Avon's final episode in the show. It's a very, very low-key, uneventful one, really. And it's lots of mourning, lots of disbelief at being arrested, and I guess the only real moment here is actually at the end, which we'll get to, involving Brianna. But yeah, it's compared to Stringer's big send-off, for perhaps an equally interesting and similar character. It's an oddly low-key send-off for him. I just thought it was worth pointing out.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess there's also the aftermath of our raid. We just see people being interviewed mainly. We have Bodhi, our smart-ass pawn, who is claiming entrapment. Or contrapment, as he calls it.
Contrapment things.
So yeah, he's smart enough to realise that he's got a way out of it. Do you have anything else to say about that sort of section after, where we see people being interviewed? We do have perhaps one of the Wire's sort of best laugh out loud moments. I think you mentioned it before, with Squeak and Bernard.
Yeah, I can't wait to go to jail. I love the fact that we can continually hear her giving Bernard shit over Bunkum Freeman's Thai chat. Like, it really does.
This background, like,
of course you want to go to jail, dude. Like, it's just, it's really, really well done, that. And Bunkum Freeman's Thai chat as well. It's just a nice little sort of side story. Perhaps pointing out how desensitized these guys are to the arrests that have gone on. And I guess Bunkum Freeman haven't seen each other in a while, have they? They may not have caught up since season 2, perhaps. So it's nice that they sort of have a little cross paths. I guess the big problem here is that despite the satisfaction of making these arrests, you can really feel when they look through the interviews how painful it must be to go through every single interview, going through successive wave after wave of people refusing to give others up.
Yeah.
And it's just this kind of constant interrogation, battle, and there's just so many of them as well, so that they communicated the kind of boredom of that quite well.
Yeah, got a lot of time in those interview rooms, that's for certain.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think it felt feasible that Bodie was, tooled up enough with his knowledge to claim entrapment here? Did that feel genuine to you?
I didn't seem like it would be something that he wouldn't know. Like, obviously, he only half knew it as well, but seems like the sort of thing that he might have overheard from D'Angelo, who might have overheard it from, Stringer or Avon or someone like that. I mean, you don't know where it might have been caught up. Like, they're not idiots, are they? Like, they're not.
No.
The whole deal is that they are actually very, very capable of great intelligence and really astute and perceptive. And it seems perfectly reasonable that someone like Bodie would be able to pick up on something like that and remember it in a key moment. I didn't question it at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't question his just kind of his bullshit detector, I guess. Really, he knows that he was selling drugs without, with sanctioning. He was told clearly by a police authority that he could sell drugs, and therefore being arrested about it later is, it's entrapment. So he's certainly a much more of a fighter than the rest of them, and that makes sense. That's what we've known Bodie as being, and it works as a very nice excuse, really, because a season 4 without Bodie would be a massively lesser of a season, really, because he's such a great character. So it's nice that they found a way to bring him back that didn't feel massively contrived at all.
Yep. They make sure he doesn't go to jail so that they can kill him.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
All those consequences that didn't exist. Yeah. So, but
that's much later.
Okay.
Much later. So let's move on to the actual bit with Marlo and the rim shop itself, where he meets his advisor Vincent. He informs Vincent of Stringer's death, and Vincent wonders who could have reached Stringer to murder him. He tells Stanfield that Avon will blame him, and Chris remarks that the notoriety will actually be good for them. Later, Snoop brags and lies to lieutenants, including Fruit, that she was there when Partlow killed Stringer. Later, Marlo, Chris, and Vincent eat dinner at the rim shop, unaware that the Barksdale organisation came close to striking against them. So, we see here that although the blame has fallen upon them, it's still looking very, very pretty for the Stanfield organisation, seeing as they're actually going to take advantage of this blame, seeing as it's just, Marlo especially lives off the fear that he generates in people. So it actually works very well for them. And they are completely ignorant to how close they came to actually getting attacked, and almost would have been very lucky to get away with their lives from that one if there had been an attack. So it's looking very pretty for the Stanfield organisation here, and we're basically seeing this close of the episode for them where it's like, yeah, they're doing very well, and you can expect to see more of them in season 4, where they become the dominant force, because now it's curtains for the Barksdales, and it's almost like they're eating dinner as like this their last meal, as their days as of having competition. It's almost like the end of the war for them, whether they realise it or not.
Yeah, and it's probably worth mentioning that despite the fact that they even write Barksdale Stanfield War on the cardboard box. Like, what sort of war has this really been for Stanfield? As much as we give them credit by the time season 4 comes around for defeating the Barksdales, all they really did was stand around and wait. And they did try and assassinate Avon once, without realizing it was Avon. So, it's been a real easy ride for them. Things have really fallen into place. And it's Vincent, before anyone else knows, Vincent knows that Marlo's going to get the blame for Stringer's death as well, and that really plays into their favour. It becomes what they call one of those good problems. Pain is what is needed by these people. It's a much darker way of running the streets, and it's nice that Snoop and Chris are now permanently in the background, and in fact the scenes later on with the Stanfields really feel like they are of season 4. It's like they've made the full transition now into Marlo's fully grown into his role. So absolutely a good day to get out on those corners and bring on season 4. Yet another big sort of transition point for our characters, making a big change between seasons.
Let's move on to our next little bit here then, seeing as we're pretty much sorted with the Stanfords, as you said. We have a bit with Omar. So Omar and Brother Mouzone arrive at Mouzone's motel room, I should say. Lamar is there, holding Dante hostage. Mouzone turns Dante over to Omar and also gives him his weapon to dispose of, telling him that he trusts him to do it properly in his hometown. And Omar assesses Dante's injuries whilst he apologises, claiming that he held out as long as he could. And it's interesting that
what's done
Omar is
done.
I mean, Omar seems kind of like disdainfully, you didn't hold out long enough, almost like he's very disappointed that he couldn't take it harder, as it were, like, to withstand the information gathering, as it were. So
yeah, it's obviously our final appearance of Brother Mouzone in the show as well, which I'm sure many will be pleased about, some not so pleased.
And this is perhaps a reflective moment for Omar as well. I mean, we're talking about characters thinking about their next step, and Omar seems to have been doing some of that recently as well. He's been kind of striking out more on his own. And obviously he's questioning what's going on with Dante here as well, whether or not you agree with it.
Yeah, they leave it ambiguous as to whether Dante gave Omar up, or whether Dante didn't give Omar up, but Omar had kind of flashbacks to the last time one of his boyfriends was tortured because of him, because of his status. And in either situation, he obviously decides, not explicitly, but it's very much implied that he decides to break up with Dante here. And they go their own separate ways. There's certainly a look of distrust and distaste as they look at each other. There's no real love in their eyes there. So
this isn't like two lovers finally reunited after this terrible separation involving violence and whatnot. It's just kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's a different kind of relationship, isn't it? So it's not going to get that typical, there's the running and embracing. You're probably not going to get that, but
no.
But in the same way, it does still feel a bit distant. It doesn't feel like much of a big reunion. He does look at him with a look of disappointment.
Yeah. So there's certainly a good chance that they gave Omar up, and that's what led to their Mexican standoff. And if not, I guess it's probably not a good idea to love someone when you're Omar, because you have so much notoriety that your loved one is a constant risk of being held to ransom. So it's a real he takes on the challenge to move on alone, and it doesn't take long before he finds Ronaldo, who's his third and final boyfriend in the show. But I guess each boyfriend is less of a boyfriend, isn't it? Because they become very much non-lovers, very much more business partners, I guess. But I still think there is some romantic energy between them. But
yeah, I mean, and like you say, this is also the final appearance of Brother Mouzone.
Yeah.
So I guess I don't know. I mean, you were saying whether or not people might think it's a good thing or a bad thing. Very, very unusual character. Doesn't really fit in with the rest of the show. Like, it is quite a jarring thing to have this quite zany character, but not a bad character by any stretch, but not really one that's fleshed out. Or I didn't find Brother Mouzone especially intriguing, really. I thought it was sort of trying quite hard to create a man of mystery and actually creating a bit of a caricature instead. It's just kind of the eccentric hitman. I didn't really get much more out of it than that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's not much to go on. It's all speculation, really, isn't it? If you want to make anything of him.
I mean, his relationship with Lamar is comedic more than anything else. Maybe it's intentional, but that's the way it comes across, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, Lamar's certainly a more interesting character. He's a lot funnier. I mean, his moments in those gay clubs were fantastic.
He just feels like he has
missed.
such a crappy job. He just seems like he really doesn't like Brother Mouzone. He's probably just paid quite well and just has to put up with his shit. You kind of like get that feeling from him. Lamar,
where's my hoppers?
Where's my magazine? It's just kind of all of that stuff. Like, I kind of feel quite sorry for him by the end, where he's just putting up with all this rubbish. Like.
It is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. obviously the final maneuver for Muzone is giving Omar his gun. I believe it is the Walther PPK. So I'm not sure if that's kind of a final mark of respect for the work we carried out together or what. But again, another not particularly explicitly explained scene, something that we just have to interpret ourselves.
So that's that little bit with Omar.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Hamsterdam. So Carver discusses the effect of breaking the story of Hamsterdam will have on the career of Colvin and his men with other officers from the district. As Carver makes his way through Hamsterdam, Johnny approaches him and asks to borrow money. Carver recognises Johnny as a drug addict and refuses. And the next morning, reporters arrive in force. Burrell learns of the media involvement and tells his colleagues Rawls and Bobby Reed. And Rawls and Reed remain concerned that Royce will blame the police department for the Hamsterdam debacle. Soon after the journalists arrive, Carcetti and Tony Gray begin to give interviews about the project, and Gray announces his intentions to run against the mayor. Beniski remarks to a colleague that he could have broken the story a week ago. Meanwhile, Herc and Truck and Colicchio watch the TV news crews videotape Hamsterdam in full swing. In his office, Royce sees the footage and realises it was a political mistake to try to sustain the Hamsterdam zones.
Okay.
So this is the sort of the closing down ceremony of Amsterdam, I suppose.
And it starts off very ominously with Johnny already having his hit money, wanting some more for the bus. Don't know. You can make of that what you will, I guess, regarding his impending death.
Yeah.
But that's the opening, I guess, and Carver's not willing to help him out. And there's a real atmosphere before that. They're still waiting for the word to come down. They've been waiting for a week. This atmosphere of the Western District officers really getting frustrated. They can't wait to get back to actually, doing the police work they enjoy, knocking their heads together, and doing the frisk searching and buy busts or whatever they're called. So there's a real appetite for this destruction that's about to happen here, which is quite sad, really, and really shows how Colvin is really this ultimate lone wolf, completely irrelevant.
And this whole collection of moments is good representation of everyone's self-interest. We see the self-interest of the reporters. They just want to break their story. Beniski's just, despite everything that's going on, he's just like, well, I could have broken this story. We see the self-interest of the candidates. They're jumping right on it, using it as an opportunity to fire back at the mayor and fire back at other characters that they want to gain some kind of political capital over. We see the self-interest of the brass and how they in the police, they don't want to have the problems fall on them. I mean, Burrell literally calls it a shit pile. So he's not exactly shedding a tear for all of these people. I mean, when they do that shot over Hamsterdam, when they sort of discover it, it looks like Walking Dead or something, It is demonstrated as something really quite apocalyptic. And then, of course, there's the mayor as well. And Royce comes to realise that maybe it wasn't a good idea after all. And in that moment, he's thinking about what the impact it would have had on his career. So it's all these people, just the fact that there's this massive event, the whole of Hamsterdam is uncovering, and they are surrounded by people who seem to be, clinging on to life or barely lucid within it. And all of the focus is on they individually could have or will have could have lost in the process of this happening. And there's just no, even though the cameras are pointed at the drug addicts, they're not really trying to learn anything about it. They're not actually investigating this. It's the action of it and what it gains people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, all those reporters rolling in and everyone just turning to hell, really. And of course we get the moment with Rawls and is it the March of the Valkyries?
It is, yeah. It's Wagner,
yeah. Yeah. So it's quite ridiculous, really, but it's one moment where I guess Rawls really feels powerful in his job if he can oversee this operation, set it off, make the commands for the other ones as well, and then play this really triumphant music over it. Only within his earshot, of course. making sure that it's truly diegetic. But yeah, it's quite funny how they've decided to portray it that way. But yeah, just overall a bit of a crazy bunch of scenes. And I guess we also get interspersed lots and lots of footage of police doing fairly shameful things to people, and then obviously our two political bods, Tony Gray and Tommy, starting to take their stands against the drugs, and Carcetti showing us that he's committed to being against Hamsterdam now. He's not really going to fight for Colvin's corner whatsoever, and D'Agostino has convinced him. So
yeah, and this is all interspersed with all those stills, the camera stills.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of season 1 style kind of surveillance footage, isn't there?
Yeah.
For the way this is shown, which is quite fitting. I also quite like how Herc has that particularly pleased look on his face as he finally sees the reporters roll in, knowing that it was him that started the ball rolling. There's a real kind of self-interested satisfaction that comes from that for him.
So yeah, this sort of the downfall of Amsterdam there. Royce as well coming to realise what a mistake it would have been, as we said.
Yeah, I like how all of a sudden we see why it made sense that Coleman Parker was literally like vomiting over their discussions, because when you see what the actual come down was, because they were so indecisive, it's actually made things far worse for Royce. And I think at the time as viewers we're hopeful, we're kind of on Royce's side, we're not really thinking about it with him, and Coleman's clearly been there a number of times, so it's really good at balancing out those interests there.
Right, so there's one more little bit for Hamsterdam if you want to move on.
Yep.
So Burrell arrives at the mayor's office to discuss their course of action. Parker tells Burrell that they plan to blame him for Hamsterdam and then relieve him of his post. But Burrell responds by blackmailing the mayor, threatening to go to the press and claim that Hamsterdam was created under pressure from the mayor, and offers an alternative. Make him commissioner for a full term and he will blame Colvin as much as possible. After his meeting, Burrell signals to Rules to begin closing down the free zones. Rules executes his plan, leading the troops to a sanctioned area with the Ride of the Valkyries playing in the background. As night falls, Hamsterdam is emptied of addicts and drug dealers. Rules tours the area with Parker and promises to have all physical evidence of the free zone bulldozed and removed from sight overnight. In one of the derelict buildings, an officer has discovered the body of Johnny Weeks, dead of an apparent overdose. Rules orders for Johnny to be moved in a prisoner transport vehicle so that there will be no ambulances for the reporters to see. So, how do you feel about Burrell with Royce to start us off? I mean, Burrell seems like a character that it's, especially here where he's just ducking and weaving to, we've been talking about the self-interest element here, like, he's so good at this. He's so good at protecting himself, and he's played the game a long time, and he knows how to pull the right card at the right moment to save himself. Although it is very satisfying, and he is surrounded by characters that are acting in this self-interested way, I know a lot of people have expressed quite a strong distaste for Burrell in general. Like, how do you feel about Burrell based on these scenes and how he worms his way out of yet another bit of difficulty by just pinning it on somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, there are villains in The Wire. Burrell isn't really one of them for me. He is contributing to bad things in the city, but you can see how he's doing it really out of necessity in most cases. And I really quite like this scene with him and Royce, where he very impressively makes this stand that really feels like it's been long coming throughout the season. And we see how it only takes one vulnerable position for Royce for all of a sudden these tides of power have turned, and Royce has had such a habit of throwing Burrell under the bus at every turn. It doesn't even seem cheeky that he's now sending him back a taste of his own, and I thought it was a great move. And despite the fact that it's kind of frustrating we don't get to see a new commissioner quite yet, the fact that the logic of it makes a lot of sense, and Burrell, we're gonna have to stick with Burrell for a little while longer yet.
Not only that, but it was Colvin's idea, so the fact that he's blaming it on him is technically the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's from his position, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, he hasn't got a shred of honor really in terms of depicting the honest situation, but his job is just so tied up in the politics, unlike anyone else in the police force, that he has by far the most pressure under that mayor. So it's tricky. It's very, very tricky. I can totally understand people's comments about him being an absolute shit pile, as he calls Hamsterdam. But there's something. I think he's put in enough compromising positions that there's an element of empathy with him that we don't get with other characters like Levy and Clay Davis. So,
okay,
that's certainly my take on it with him.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I agree. Like, I don't really share that same level of contempt for Burrell. Like, I think he's in a lot of these positions and he knows exactly how to worm his way out of them, as is necessary part of his job. It seems like that is the game that he's playing. So. And certainly in this situation, he's not doing anything particularly immoral. You know, like I say, it is actually Colvin who is to blame here. It was his idea. He put it into effect. So it actually makes perfect sense. We're not seeing him worm out of something that he deserves to take the hit for. He's actually quite satisfyingly laying it on Royce's door for a change. So yeah, it's nicely done, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just great how this sets off a massive political chain of shifting allegiances. I'm sure we'll get into those, but it works its way all the way up to Daniels, via Watkins, via Marlo Daniels. So it's a really cool bit of politics here that we'll get to follow as we go through.
And we had the bit that you mentioned before with Rules playing his Wagner. Very much enjoying the action of seeing all of these people going over the top, as it were.
Yeah.
And then
it didn't feel too over the top. There was a scene afterwards where he's looking very, very villainous, and he sort of throws his cap on his head and smugly enjoys the carnage going on around him. That was perhaps a little step too far.
Well, I meant over the top in the World War I sense.
Okay.
In the sort of they've all been sat there waiting to begin their assault, as it were, you know,
and climb out the trenches. Yeah.
So yeah,
no. So
it feels like something
good.
Rules has been waiting to do for a very long time.
Yeah. Derives some real physical satisfaction from the job, and he's got it here now. And I quite like the way they did. Burrell sort of phoned in to him and said, "The deal is done. It's time to destroy Hamsterdam." And then, of course, he, as the second in command, phones the other units at the other free zones, sets it all into action, and then reports back to Burrell. Very evocative of that season 1 scene with D'Angelo, Stringer, and Wallace, and the death of Brandon, and the way that was orchestrated throughout the chain of command. So that was quite cleverly done.
And we also have the discovery of Johnny's body having died from an overdose, or an apparent overdose.
Yeah.
And he is basically discarded as an unseen. They don't want anyone to know that somebody's actually died here, so they just hide him away in a prisoner transport. And that, in a strange sort of way, as upsetting as it is actually pretty fitting for Johnny, I think, seeing as he's been that kind of character. Like, he's just could be any sort of drug addict on the street. He just happens to be one that we focused on because of Bubbles, and doesn't really. It's a very difficult character to empathise with, even though he should in some ways be the most he is in some ways like the most heartbreaking, just because his whole life is just dedicated to getting high. He doesn't have anything going on, and that has ended up killing him in the most predictable fashion imaginable. That when he was given this open, free market where he didn't even have to worry about getting caught, he didn't have to scheme in the same way. It was pretty much guaranteed to be the death of him, and so it was. And his death is considered so irrelevant in that sense that he just gets carted away in an invisible manner, so that no one has to even acknowledge that he's been killed. Yeah. And who is really likely to be there to mourn for him? It's never suggested that he has anyone in his life other than Bubbles, and we've seen that those two aren't even really connected on the street anymore. So yeah, it's like this. It's afterthought to this whole scene, and in that sense, it is the perfect seeing off for Johnny.
Yeah, it's really good. Not even the ambulances are allowed to come and see him. Like, he's just kind of discarded as a probable death, which he appears to be, and it's just even more tragic. They couldn't have made it possibly more tragic. He literally died in the final hour of Hamsterdam. If he perhaps survived one more day, he would have found it difficult to find another hit. He would have now had to have scrounged for more money, not been able to operate in this free market, and perhaps he would have, had to have gone through more withdrawal, actually survived a bit longer. But he literally waited for the final moment of this Amsterdam experiment to kind of drop off the radar.
What is that guy says to him in the earlier scene, the one where he sees Bubbles out on the street, says something like, "You got to be careful, or you're gonna do something." I can't remember exactly what he says, but
he just sort of says you're gonna die. Basically,
you're gonna kill yourself with how heavy it's hitting it, and sure enough, that's what happens.
Exactly. The signs have been here for a while now, and I like the way that that white Amsterdam flag falls as well, just before we see him, just to hit the point home a little bit more.
Right, let's take a look at Cutty.
Okay.
Cutty meets with his old flame Grace Sampson outside of the school where she works as a teacher. Cutty tells her about the community boxing gym that he has founded. The two reminisce, but Grace rebuffs Cutty's advances. She tells him that she's proud of him, and later Cutty shows a video of Muhammad Ali's first fight against Floyd Patterson to the young boxing enthusiasts. And after the Hamsterdam zones are closed down and Avon is arrested, Cutty finds that many of his young boxers stop attending the gym because there is work for them selling drugs for Marlo instead. Cutty tracks Justin down and finds him at work on a corner, and he's eating a bag of chips, or a bag of crisps, I suppose I should say, but this is America, so I'll say chips. Fruit arrives and shares an awkward silence with Cutty, which is noted by Justin. And Justin promises to be at the gym at 3:30, and as Cutty leaves, he glares at an anxious Fruit, who then orders his dealers to get back to work.
Yeah, so we see Cutty's been on a big journey throughout this season. He's developed a lot. I guess in Cutty's mind, perhaps he hasn't even got over the first hurdle yet. The first hurdle for him is getting back with Grace and getting to a point where he can prove that he is worthy of her, or she is worthy of him. And it's just a complete delusion. She's moved on completely. She clearly has a family and a job she's holding down. And there's some real pain there that Cutty needs to spend some time getting over before he moves on. And yeah, a really sad scene to revisit from before with Grace. And it's nice to see Grace at least trying to be a little bit more understanding. But again, rejecting his advances completely.
And when she says that she's proud of him, and it feels genuine. Feels like she genuinely respects what he's done. He's clearly cleaned up his act, and the whole community boxing gym is going well for him, so she genuinely is happy for him. But she's left him behind a long time ago.
Yeah, she had 14 years to clean herself up. He had, he's had a couple of months probably. So, in that time frame, he's done well. But there's a lot more emotional changes that need to occur that Cutty just isn't really prepared for yet. So, yeah, that's a good little scene. And then, of course, we get Cutty showing the video of Muhammad Ali to the young boys.
It doesn't seem to enthrall them perhaps as much as he might hope it would.
No. They seem to be laughing more at the person who's got defeated rather than the victor. And I like Cutty's line about, if you're still standing at the end, then you're not weak. Like that's the first rule of boxing.
Yeah. And
so it's teaching these kids real good lessons.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. They're kind of obsessed with the person who's getting beat. They like to imagine that as being their opponent, the person who is getting knocked down. But as Cutty reminds them, someone who still stood at the end of any round is someone that you should still respect.
Feels like a real valuable lesson for the street here, and so the boxing gym really works on a number of levels, definitely.
And it ties into
which makes it so sad. Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Sorry, which makes it so sad that they decide to run away almost straight after. But sorry, yeah, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was just going to say that it ties into what is clearly Cutty's aim overall. Is it's part of this new life philosophy, if you like, that he's trying to adopt. In that, he's still standing despite everything. So he should have respect for himself. He has to have the self-respect necessary to keep doing what he's doing if he's going to if he's going to maintain the life that he wants to lead rather than just falling back into whatever position he is that he thinks can make him some money.
Yeah, definitely.
We have him having to track down the boys later on because they've gone off to work for Marlo now that he's got the corners back. And it reminds him that he's supposed to be, he was in training, so he's not supposed to be eating junk food. And then has to share a bit of an awkward moment with Fruit, who, is only alive because Cutty decided not to shoot him.
Yeah, really, really powerful scene, actually. Fruit really considering how much he owes to Cutty at this point, I guess. And having to let his guard down in front of his young'uns, which he can't enjoy too much.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like that's why Cutty gets his boys back. Fruit is so indebted to Cutty and therefore doesn't feel like he can talk them out of going to the class. That there's this element that, he can't say anything to Cutty now that would possibly piss him off. So I quite like that, that kind of feels like a real full circle story for Cutty in that way. And he's wearing that Kangol that he nearly shot off his head back in episode 5, I think it was.
Yeah. See Cutty actually commanding quite a bit of respect.
Yeah.
As well, seeing as earlier on, had no response whatsoever, but now he's actually a bit of a figure of authority for these boys. So
he's that's obviously really going to help him out as well in terms of gaining the respect from the kids. And yeah, just a nice reward for what he what he managed to go through earlier in terms of not shooting Fruit and staying true to his conscience, really.
Strangely, his life with the Barksdales and all of the confidence and swagger that must have given him, although his actions put him in jail, following that, he's been able to use that confidence and that ability to actually apply some authority to people who he doesn't want to make the same mistakes as him. So it's like it's an appropriate happening for the arc, and it's a really satisfying story here. And although we mentioned before that not everything does go perfectly for him at the end, it's a fairly minor issue compared with the successes that he's made, and this is a very, very positive, just generally a very, very positive season for Cutty as a character.
Yeah.
He's a very uplifting character to watch in this season.
Well, we see that he picks himself up by just doing a few hours of punch bagging, and goes back out and tries his best and succeeds, and just really, really keeps on that string of positivity. And it never really wanes, actually. Cutty's arc remains very, very uplifting throughout. He has a few wobbles when he starts experimenting with new ladies. But, on the whole, very, very likeable character, very enjoyable storyline. And I think it's worth mentioning, since we saw Cutty's students wander off because of Marlo's package, just how much of a masterclass this episode is in interconnecting lots and lots of separate stories. I mean, all of them affect one another in very, very big ways here, with Hamsterdam being at the centre of it all, and the politicians, the upcoming politicians, the established politicians all have to go through very major changes. Obviously, the detail have to deal without any backup because of Hamsterdam. Bubbles manages to find loads and loads of scrap metal thanks to Hamsterdam. There's just all sorts of streams that just come in and overlap completely. And it's this sort of thing that makes The Wire so enthralling in episodes like this, and something that's really lacking in other big scope shows. The main one that comes to mind is Game of Thrones, where everything is very, very distant for a long time. So it's all those intertwining little themes that make it such a fantastic episode here.
Yeah, I guess in Game of Thrones they all happen independently and then all come together at some grand moment.
The final episode, perhaps, but until for the moment, that there's whispers across the sea of different things happening, but it's very much a bunch of separate stories, unlike The Wire, where everything is so impactful of everything else, and we see how these institutions react without anyone realizing. So really, really cool. And even though the Barksdales had nothing to do with Hamsterdam, Bodhi was still able to use Hamsterdam to get out of jail in that situation. So I just thought it was pretty fantastic how they made everything link up.
Yeah, it's a real feat in storytelling to get it be this complex and have these many sort of things happening. This amount of effect on different characters and different scenarios and different places, and it really feels like it's encompassing an entire city.
Yeah.
And I guess it comes from the novelistic style that the show has adopted.
Yeah, exactly. And the final realization for me was the scene with Cutty at the end when his kids suddenly run away, and you're like, hang on a minute, why are you running away? And like, well, Marlo's got his package back out. And you're like, oh yeah, of course, like he would. Like this is the next knock-on effect from what's happening elsewhere in the city, and it's that kind of dynamic story, the way it folds through, that makes it just so interesting.
So that's Cutty in this episode. Pretty positive finish for him for the season. Now we have one more section to go before we reach our big aftermath section, which deals with everything that happens following these events and kind of deals with the closing of the season. But before we do that, let's take a look at the few relationships that we deal with before the end. Starting with after a day at work, Greggs has a one-night stand and ignores a phone call from her partner Cheryl. Daniels celebrates the promotion with a public meal with Perlman, and Daniels tells Perlman that now that Marla has obtained the mayor's support, she no longer needs her husband. So later they have sex and laugh together about their good fortune. And McNulty visits Beadie and tells her that he would be interested in pursuing a relationship with her. She asks what happened to prompt him to visit her, and he struggles to explain it, but eventually settles by saying that he's finished something, and confesses that he feels that the qualities that make him a good detective also make him wrong for everything else. Beadie invites him in for a drink, but he declines. Instead, McNulty asks to meet her kids. So we have 3, although maybe you could say 4 relationships going on here. We have what's going on with Greggs and Cheryl and how that's obviously falling apart. And Greggs is now very much doing, I guess you could say, the McNulty thing with the one-night stand and the getting cover. We have Daniels and Perlman now enjoying a public relationship, and as a result, the disintegration that comes from the disintegration of the Daniels relationship with Marla. And we also have McNulty, as part of his transformation, taking a very responsible and level-headed and not rushing into anything, taking this new stance with Beadie, who he obviously feels like has a more genuine connection for, rather than this, what he obviously realises was wrong through D'Agostino, where it was just obviously very physical, and he finally realises that he's basically being used and needs something more meaningful, needs something that's more than just the short-term pleasure.
And which is so heartwarming to see. And I guess you could also throw the Cutty and Grace in there as well, which hasn't really developed, but that's a 5th relationship that's covered in this episode. There's an awful lot of the personal stuff interwoven with all the action. So I guess should we start with the Kima?
Yeah. What's interesting that in the way that it starts us off with these 3 is that they're like different stages. We start off as this immediate cut into the sex scene with Greggs and whoever this random lady is. It's like the very full-on scene, very suddenly. And it's interesting how we have what is basically just, it's obviously just lust. It's just a one-night stand. And then we have sex again, but it's with Daniels and Perlman. But that's like a very loving, more intimate scene. Obviously, we understand that their relationship has come a long way, and they're very happy about being able to be public now. They don't have to hide it. So that's more love. And then we have McNulty later on, who is abstaining entirely. So it's like these 3 levels. It's like 3 different levels of the relationship.
That's a really good point, actually, yeah.
And one that is kind of based purely on a sort of romantic, not actually getting to that stage yet, which is, for McNulty, is, unusual.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So it's an interesting 3 stages for these relationships when you compare them.
And they seem to be a lot more sort of graphically explicit than other scenes in the show. Obviously the first 2 there. And Cheryl calling up again. I mean, we haven't seen Cheryl in a long time. I would have assumed that it would have fizzled out completely, but clearly Cheryl is still trying to salvage something here, and Kima is kind of coming to terms and peace with the fact that she is no longer a parent to the child and a wife to the husband, or vice versa. But yeah, it's pretty sad stuff to see that, and she's really fallen into the McNulty ways. And of course, Daniels' relationship really develops, and that is all because of Burrell making the stand against Royce. Because Burrell makes the stand against Royce, Royce then has to suck up to Watkins, who wants to see Burrell fired. And to appease Watkins, he decides to endorse Marla rather than, what's her name again, Unetta Perkins. And then as soon as Marla is in the good books, there's no pressure on Daniels to no longer become Major. So he becomes Major. Marla can see him off, and the relationship can go public. So that was the big political chain I was mentioning earlier, and how it has all these big implications across multiple people.
Yeah, there's another great example of brilliant, multifaceted storytelling and having these knock-on effects. It's brilliantly done.
Definitely, yeah. And
then finally,
clearly Rhonda's.
Sorry, carry on.
Clearly Rhonda's very, very happy. For the first time, really, she's found a relationship that really feels like it could go somewhere. I mean, obviously with McNulty there was constant disappointment, and with Daniels so far there's been a lot of question marks over his dedication to Marla, I'm sure, running through her head. And now that this big revelation, this loss of pressure from Marla has come, she's finally found, a quite happy place for the first time in the show. And there's a sense of that as well with McNulty, as his relationship is obviously in a very early stage, but it's just so nice to see him being really aware of his actions and really not falling for any of the previous traps, really, really being aware of where they are and not falling for them.
Like he says, it feels like he's finished something.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't need to be said what that is. We soon find out.
Yeah.
But basically his detective days are over.
He says, someone said something, which is obviously Freeman earlier. He doesn't really know how to put that into a kind of digestible sentence, I guess. But, it certainly feels like he's trying to be honest and break through to her. And, yeah, it's good. And if anything, BD is tempting him. She's inviting him straight in. And McNulty's the one who backs away.
But not entirely, as he's showing, he's showing a greater commitment than that. He's showing that he wants to meet her kids. It's not just about, that short-term play, that short-term pleasure, going in and having a drink and, maybe having a bit of fun as a result of that. Like, he's showing a more long-term understanding, and that if he is going to be involved with this woman, well, he needs to know her kids if she has kids. So
yeah,
kind of takes that responsible long-term view instead.
Definitely, yeah. And then obviously it's nice that McNulty and Rhonda back to back find quite happy love situations here. Not that McNulty's is really fully realised yet, but those two were really not good for each other, but now they've both found links that are good for them, which I thought was a nice little parallel. So yeah, quite a few relationships towards the end of this episode have a nice little montage. I don't know what you made of the punch bag going off in between Rhonda and Daniels' lovemaking.
Yeah, it was I'm not quite sure exactly what to make of it. I guess there's an element of passion involved. That obviously there's this confirmed passion from the closure of what's going on with their relationship. They can feel more comfortable about how public it is, and they're enjoying it that way. And then we have Cutty, who is involved with the passion of his boxing, and that now is his life. He's now involving himself in that, and it's kind of the intensity with which they're approaching it, I guess, is something that you could compare the two, but I don't know, that might seem a little ham-fisted.
Yeah, no, certainly big
No
emotional
pun
outpour.
intended on the fisting.
That was the latest scene. But yeah, it certainly got very sweaty. There's a great YouTube video that really we might have to link to regarding
I know the one you mean.
Major Daniels' final movement. But it's there's something really quite. There's a lot of gravity to that final movement because obviously Daniels has had a fantastic day. He's sort of won the jackpot. He's finally been able to realise an honest relationship, not have to hide away, but out of the public. And he's also been promoted to do with the same reasons. He's finally got his major posting. So clearly things are looking very, very good for Daniels at the moment. And so there we go.
Yes, so we've come through to our very final section now, our aftermath, our closing of the season. We'll start with Colvin's job offer as Deputy Director of Security for Johns Hopkins is withdrawn after Burrell personally phones his employers to tell them about Hamsterdam. Colvin faces further humiliation from Burrell and Rawls, who insist that he take full responsibility for his actions by accepting a demotion to lieutenant. Rawls and Burrell relieve Colvin of duty at their next Comstat meeting and make Dennis Mello the acting commander. The mayor also faces financial difficulties over Hamsterdam, as the US Deputy Drug Czar visits to tell them that they are considering cutting almost $500 million in federal funding for Baltimore and will interdict any attempts to support a geographical entity within the United States where drugs are legal. Royce tries to reassure him that the Amsterdam zones were the result of one rogue police commander and manages to keep the department's funding. And Royce meets with Odell Watkins later, who urges him to fire Burrell over Hamsterdam. But due to Burrell's threats, Royce refuses to let Burrell go, and as you mentioned before, in relation to our relationship section, he tries to appease Watkins by offering support for Marlo Daniels' run for a city council seat, knowing that Watkins is mentoring her. So first off, we have Colvin. He realises that he's going to have to suffer. He knows that the weight is going to come down on him. The first thing is that he can't even move on to the job that he wanted to do. He can't escape. The whole reasoning behind him taking these actions, that he was going to retire and it wasn't going to be a problem for him. Actually, he didn't realise the impact that it could have on his future as well. Not just it wasn't like his whole life before him would just disappear if he was going to move on to another job. Burrell has actually kind of sniped that job away from him. And he doesn't even end up with his the pay grade that he expected either.
Really, really tragic stuff.
Yeah, it's brutal.
So brutal. And it's not even like Burrell gave him a bad reference. Like, he actively chose to phone up his next employer and give him an awfully bad report about how he's, a lone ranger who does not understand authority and all this rubbish. So
you should know that this entire thing that just happened in Baltimore with the free zones, that is entirely this man's idea. It's just obviously laying it thick on him.
And obviously that isn't just aimed at Bunny. I'm sure it's mostly aimed at insulating him and making sure that any blame is continually removed from his office.
Well, as they say, most people are not against you; they're just for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really, really painful to see that, and without those high ambitions, I guess he has to, he decides to do something very noble next season. He moves to the school and helps out with new forward-thinking academic kind of studies there. But yeah, it's bad to see that, and Johns Hopkins is out the window. We do see that he winds up at a hotel as a hotel security man. So that's kind of his backup, we can assume.
Yeah, he's between jobs.
Yeah, between jobs. And then, of course, just to put the icing on the cake, he gets a call saying that it's his first day back at work tomorrow, and first thing on the calendar is Comstat. So it's like, ouch, like, ah. So.
And he also has his get on with it, doesn't he? He does one as well.
Yes, that's right. Those who most need to be heard are cut off by a system who's too broken to even consider what they're saying. Just like with Stringer, In this case, he has no chance to speak. Yeah, I mean, as far as Colvin goes, I guess that's it, is it? Should we move on to...
We have Royce dealing with the US Deputy Drug Czar, who has obviously heard about this and is coming down to flex the might of the feds, and saying that they will take out an awful lot of money if they take any action that supports it. Obviously, this is just hitting home even further for Royce that it would have been a terrible idea politically for him to support it, because there would have been no support that would come from it for anyone that would have been able to keep him in that position of mayor. Yeah,
and obviously adds credence to Coleman Parker's advice earlier on. Yeah, $500 million, wasn't it? That was the figure quoted.
Yeah.
$500 million, and to think that we saw this problem grow from Colvin's little pilot scheme in the Western to this ridiculously damaging financial sort of burden that's coming rearing its head now. Like the ultimate consequences here.
And we already mentioned the bit with Odell Watkins. We already kind of referenced that, where Royce has to kind of appease him by supporting Marlo Daniels.
Yeah, and it feels like he's literally just moving around his political allies as pieces of meat here, just putting them in the position where they'll either help him out or won't help him out. And it really explains how the consequences of that is that some people are unexpectedly boosted up the chain and some people are unexpectedly shat on. And obviously in this case, Daniels was on the good receiving end of that, just out of chance, and was boosted straight to major.
What's interesting as well is that isn't Marlo, because Marlo is like running against Unetta, is it Unetta Perkins?
Yeah,
she's running against. This episode is actually the first time that Unetta Perkins appears, because it's like meant to be this ongoing thing that she's never actually present at any of the meetings until this episode, which is the episode where she gets ousted. So we were talking before about characters being unlucky with the timings or turning up at convenient moments or whatever. Like, this is another moment, a very subtle one in Unetta Perkins, and that the joke is Marlo has been running against someone who is supposedly never present, and the one time we actually see them is the episode in which they get kicked out.
Yeah.
So,
or perhaps that's where they were kicked out too. They just become like a sub-member of the committee rather than a councilwoman. Although I guess that their term can't end yet, can it? It has to wait. So, but yeah, it's funny how we see her. Perhaps she was sort of scared heavily by what happened and decided to start behaving again.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next little bit. This is a smaller section. We have Carcetti planning his next move with D'Agostino. At the next meeting, Carcetti lets Gray ask the most penetrating questions, as D'Agostino advised him. And Burrell is true to his promise and places the blame firmly with Colvin, as we've seen. Carcetti refuses to accept their excuses and makes a speech about his inability to forgive the way that West Baltimore has been neglected. After Carcetti's speech, Watkins is congratulatory, and Gray finally realizes that Carcetti is also planning to run against Royce and feels betrayed. So this bit, I kind of thought I'd single this out, as it does have that big Carcetti speech in it. As I said, it's the point at which Carcetti's mayoral bid is pretty much opened. Public based on this.
Yeah.
And, he's planning his next move, and we're gearing up into Carcetti in Season 4, who is very, 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 very important in that season.
Yeah. Yep. So obviously, this is perhaps the real Comstat in terms of where Burrell and Rules are sitting here. They're facing the ultimate scrutiny for what happened in Hamsterdam, and Carcetti kind of half endorses Hamsterdam for the sake of the emotion and for trying to get people rallied up and behind him, and it's really, really quite something to see this speech suddenly come out of him, and we can really see the effects of his training. I think here we haven't heard him really publicly speak for a while, and it's clear that he's now no longer following all those facts and being quite aggressive with the way he does things. He's really trying to rally the people behind him, and it's easy to get lost in kind of the emotion of what he's saying. And again, the show is trying to send mixed messages, but we keep getting glimpses of D'Agostino grinning. We keep getting glimpses of Tony Gray frowning, just to remind us that the intentions behind the actual speech may not be as they sound. But in that moment, I think I was pretty swept up in it, and it's a fantastic speech that would have been an absolute, kick opener to the campaign.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in it, certainly, whilst forgetting that the language that he's using, Carcetti's basically backing the same old story. Like, it's all about war and military, and we've got to fight against all these terrible people ruining our city. And he's not actually proposing anything revolutionary at all. It's an impassioned speech along the same lines that many other people will have made before him. But given the circumstances and given how eloquently it's given, it's like you say, you get swept up in it. But the reality is that it's business as usual, really.
Yeah,
he's supporting the very thing that's causing the problems. That kind of undue sort of propensity towards seeing it as a war and seeing it as necessary violence and fighting, rather than proposing a genuinely novel scheme to solve the issues.
Yeah. It's odd because obviously before this, when they were planning it, we saw that D'Agostino told Tommy to save the best questions for Gray because he needs a bigger boost at this point than he does. But we see that perhaps he is too tempted by this open door for him to make this amazing speech, and hopes he'll catch up later on in the campaign. But clearly D'Agostino's not too upset about it. She's really, really very, very impressed here.
But Tony Gray is. Sounds like you're running for something.
Yep. Oh, man. That must have been very difficult as well. Like, that's the end of the relationship right there. They were best friends before going into that hall, and from this point onwards, it's awkward.
Yep.
And, that's a real betrayal that he was having a hard time coming to terms with. But again, another moment of him going against his real, his real gut instincts, for the sake of that pragmatism that we mentioned.
And that's, like you say, that's something that Carcetti's got to deal with, especially as we see him going into season 4 and the decisions that he has to make and the deals he has to do in order to get to that mayoral position. This is just a minor footnote in the tough decisions that he has to make.
Definitely, yeah.
Alienating Tony Gray is pretty minor as it goes.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah.
So let's move on to our next little bit of the aftermath, part 3.
Alrighty.
So Daniels reports the success of his case to Burrell, who then refers to him as Major Daniels. Surprised at the belated promotion, Daniels is told by Burrell that his promotion has been approved due to the mayor's alliance with his wife Marlo, and that with the Western District vacancy, he will be named District Commander immediately. McNulty visits the Western District and talks and shares a joke with Colvin. McNulty thanks him for the information on Avon and tells him that Stringer is dead and Avon has been arrested. He also admits to Colvin that Stringer was named as the informant on the warrant for Barksdale's war room. And Daniels follows up on his promise to McNulty that he would have to leave the unit once the Barksdale case was over, although he appears willing to allow McNulty to stay on, if McNulty will promise to remain loyal in the future. Daniels is surprised when McNulty accepts the dismissal readily, admitting that he would be better off doing something else. McNulty tells Daniels that he plans to return to the Western District because it feels like home. So much of that first bit we've kind of covered already. We have Daniels getting his promotion, and he's obviously ending up as Western District Commander. We have an interesting scene with McNulty and Colvin. We kind of see that landfill atop the Western District building. There's hundreds and hundreds of those cans.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, the cans, once you sort of roll back the curtain and see what the police department is made of, it's an ugly place. But yeah, it's nice that both Colvin and McNulty give in to the no cans on the roof policy, as they've done many a time before, I'm sure. It's a really, really nice moment. And it seems to get McNulty very nostalgic, doesn't it, this visit? He refers to this visit a lot when he goes to see Beatty straight after. And that being back here kind of stirred something for him, perhaps brought him back to the better days before, when things are a bit more stable between him and Elena, perhaps. So it makes sense that this is his jumping off point. He wants to go back here and go back to basics, even if it won't perhaps stimulate his intellectual detective mind as much.
Yeah, he knows that it will be better for him.
Yeah.
He goes the whole way with Daniels, keeps his promise that he will be leaving. So, yeah, it's definitely, there's no doubt about it. This is him moving on. And like you say, the return to the Western there has just been that extra push that he needed to maybe try and realise a more, just a simpler life for him.
Yeah. And oddly enough, by leaving the detail, he's staying under Daniels, because Daniels will now be his new boss at the Western. So he's retaining his boss despite moving departments. I was shocked to see Daniels being fairly soft on him, really. I guess it was quite a while ago since they got back on Stringer, and since they've been back on Stringer, McNulty's been behaving himself. He's been finding things to do with the case. I guess also that Daniels really knows that he is an asset, despite how much of a pain he is to deal with. And as McNulty says, the things that make me right for this job make me wrong for everything else. He is, a real help to them. And he makes this point again next episode when he says, can we not get you back on the detail? I'm fed up of using you in the radio car.
And Daniels is feeling pretty high off his promotion and whatnot, so he's probably in a good mood. If now would be the time to ask him for something.
Yep. Yeah, very true.
He's obviously feeling quite magnanimous.
You're not wrong there, sir, yeah. No, so all sorts of little transitioning to season 4 developments here. And Daniel's leaving the detail, which is quite a big deal, really. I think, is it Asher who takes over from now, who is the very, very lax commander who literally lets Freeman run things.
Right, shall we move on to the montage?
Yeah.
So this is quite a big bit. Let's get through this. So the season closes with a montage of scenes. We see Herc and Colicchio arresting young dealers, Tony Gray campaigning for mayor, Carver, Santangelo and McNulty attend a roll call briefing in the Western, the Hamsterdam zones are reduced to a pile of rubble, Carver visits Cutty's gym and finds him training young boxers, Crutchfield cuts Bunk's tie off as he sleeps at his desk, Donette cries over the men she has lost whilst Tyrell plays with his toys, Omar stands in silent contemplation before throwing his weapons into the Baltimore harbour near the docks, where Union campaign posters for Frank Sobotka can still be seen. Drug dealing continues throughout Baltimore, and Baldy walks the streets alone. Daniels and Sidner take down the Barksdale Investigation Board. Carcetti also begins his campaign for mayor as his family watches him give a speech. McNulty walks his beat in the Western and greets members of the community he polices. Brianna attends Avon's trial but walks out after he looks at her. Chris and Marlo also arrive at the trial, and Avon finally sees and acknowledges his adversary. Pullman prosecutes Avon along with the Barksdale organisation members Shamrock, Poot, Perry, Gerard, Sapper, Puddin, Arthur Carroll and some others, and they're all defended by Morris Levy.
Yeah, so lots of changes, but also everything staying the same. I quite like the picks that bid farewell to the oldies, D'Angelo, Stringer, and then followed by Sobotka. They kind of are three major losses so far in the show, and indicate new starts for many. So, and Donette, I think, is perhaps the third person who is mourning Avon's death. Stringer's death, following Avon and McNulty.
Yeah, despite everything, she's lost a lot of people in her life.
Yeah, so it's he at least had 3 people behind him. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of good moments there. I quite like seeing Bodie walking the streets alone. Makes sense. He was the only one who managed to get out of that cell room or the interrogation room. And of course, the only other Barksdales that escaped were Slim, who was staking out the Stanfield garage, rim shop, and Slim's other henchmen. So that, of course, they then become their own entity. They become an independent drug empire-y thing, whatever you call them, and they become one of the arms of the co-op. Although, as we see, Marlo gains a lot of territory over the next couple of years, and things start getting very tricky. So that's certainly cool to see Bodhi sort of walking the streets alone, moving on to new things.
It's strange as well that the music for this montage is sort of talking about a fast train, whereas originally we heard about a slow train. That kind of complicates the whole train metaphor even more.
I guess how quickly life moves on.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that is true. Those trains.
We see that Marlo is cruel to the very end as well, as he goes to Avon's hearing.
Yeah, just to humiliate him a little bit more. Also feels like he goes over a little bit to almost let Avon, kind of pass the baton from Avon. I'm now going to be the one who wears the crown.
Yeah.
There's kind of that nod of affirmation a little bit. So there's definitely that. And of course they sit on the right, whereas Brianna was sitting on the left of the room. And Avon was constantly looking for some sort of acknowledgement from her, which she wouldn't give. And I think...
gets acknowledgement from Marlo instead.
Yeah, scarily enough. And we don't know whether it's Avon related or... we don't know whether it's D'Angelo related or Stringer related, but clearly Brianna is really disowning her brother right now, which can't be easy for him to go through amongst everything else he's dealing with.
Interesting as well that we get a little snapshot of Frank Sobotka, with those posters still up down at the docks.
Yes.
Just a little
really,
reminder.
Really good. The show occasionally sort of reminds us of the stuff in the past, which is great, yeah.
Especially with season 2, which is it is somewhat separate to the rest of the seasons, I suppose. It sometimes feels... So it's just a reminder of the connection still. Yeah.
Definitely, it does need just a few things to bring us back to it, and obviously the Greeks do come back in season 4, or at least Spiros does, so that kind of then adds a lot of credence to why season 2 needed to happen. But yeah, it's nice that we get those little reminders.
So yeah, like you say, that the general theme with the montage is that despite all these things changing, they're still very much the same. Yeah.
Although a few things will change for good, like we're saying goodbye to some pretty major Barksdales here, notably Shamrock, and Poot, and is it Perry, the big guy?
Yep. Gerard and Sapper are there.
Gerard and Sapper, Bubbles and Squeak, not Bubbles and Squeak, Bernard and Squeak.
Yep.
They're all getting locked up. We won't see them again. They will find an excuse to bring Poot back late next season. Probably because he bounces well off Bodhi and he wasn't really worth losing as a character. He had some value to him. But yeah, it's a really an end of an era for the Barksdale guys.
And then finally we have a sort of a coda, if you like, after the montage, where we see Bubbles picking through the wreckage of Hamsterdam with his new young protege. Colvin stands amid the demolished buildings and Bubbles greets him, reminiscing about the brief golden era where drug addicts were able to indulge their habit without being hassled by police or drug dealers. And when Colvin asks if Hamsterdam was a good thing, Bubbles hesitates, then tells him he doesn't know, but the things seem to have returned to the old routine. And it seems interesting or fitting that we started the season with a demolition and we've ended with one as well.
Yeah.
That's sort of our full circle reform going on there.
Another government-sanctioned demolition job with no real plans for reform behind it whatsoever.
We've just removed all of the stuff that was undesirable, but we have no plan to actually replace it.
Yeah. In fact, they even mentioned that they'd bulldoze it, didn't they, the next day, which has not happened. So it's just going to sit there, piling up dust.
Yep.
It's nice that the only good thing to come of this destruction is that the enterprising fiends have lots of scrap metal that they can go and sell instead of wander around Hamsterdam. So Bubs is still with his protege from a couple of episodes back, who's not Sherrod, although maybe is meant to be Sherrod under a different actor's name. I don't know. So it's called that, and I like the fact that Bubbles explicitly says he's schooling him about this stuff, really bringing in that education theme for next time. And yeah, not knowing if it's a good thing. He's certainly positive towards Hamsterdam. He seems to mourn its loss a little bit.
Yeah, I suppose it worked out pretty nicely for him. It does also feel like Colvin is, he's looking for someone to be on his side. He's looking for someone to tell him that he did the right thing, someone that he did a good thing. And the one person who he thinks might have gained from it, the drug addict, as it were, still doesn't quite get what he's looking for, even from Bubbles.
Yeah, that's a very good.
And it makes for quite a harsh ending for Colvin.
Yeah. All right, and with that, the season closes.
So that's the end of season 3.
Damn.
So before we take a look at our final sections, is there anything that you want to say about season 3 as a whole? Kind of its key points, its key themes, anything about it that kind of distinguishes it as a season?
So obviously we have, as with all seasons, we have an introduction of a new institution, the politics, which plays into it less than the Docks did, for example, last time, but eventually became a very, very strong part of it. But I think uniquely this season also has its own theme that other seasons don't, and it's obviously got that reform theme running through it. And I feel like in the other seasons it becomes very much just an institutional thing. I guess you could say education is a theme as well, but it's very much about our main pillar characters, Stringer, Carcetti, Cutty, Colvin, and to some extent McNulty, I guess, later on, all are just changing things, making things better, against popular opinion, and in most cases failing, really, occasionally succeeding in the case of Cutty and McNulty. I guess that's kind of just a broad sweep of the season, looking at it, sort of broad strokes.
Yeah, and we also deal with the 9/11 / War on Terror analogy that David Simon has said the whole thing is supposed to be a bit of an analogy for. Certainly that ties into the very beginning, where we have our 2 towers coming down, and it leads across throughout trying to bring about reform, trying to sort of almost enforce that kind of freedom upon people, and about taking an idea about having a free zone and enforcing it upon people and enforcing it upon an area and upon a city that may not necessarily support it, even though it's a good idea. And nobody really expresses a dislike for the idea itself. Nobody actually comes out and says, that what we're doing here is morally wrong or anything like that, or we shouldn't be distributing drugs in this way. It's almost all to do with the political side of it and what individuals stand to lose as a result of their reputations or their interests. So it's just how that kind of reform is difficult, because it's not based on what actually people want or what is good for them, but rather how it affects their immediate interests.
How it affects the people in power,
yeah,
and their ability to preserve themselves in those positions.
And those people in power are very much under the microscope in this season, because a lot of it is about the politics. It starts to deal with those upper echelons of the local political scene, and it also demonstrates that once you are deep into that kind of reform, irrespective of whether or not it's working, you can't just decide that you don't want to do it anymore and abandon it. Because, as Slim says to Avon, once you're in it, you're in it. And that's demonstrated very strongly to Avon as well with his war.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to bring up a list of all the connections we've made to the 9/11 situation, but there have been so many this season. It's quite astonishing, really, how they've found all these ways to tie it in, with the idea of blaming something else and calling it something different, and all the linkages with the kind of failed reform, the imagery with 9/11 early on It's all there.
Another one in this
Even
episode with rules like self-congratulatory show of force, and that they're not really doing anything particularly impressive. There's all these people, all these police officers and the tactical units that they've got going around bullying people and pushing them around, but they're just a bunch of dope fiends. They're not actually like putting up a fight. It's not a fight. It's not a war in that sense. It's like they're just rounding them up, and but they're playing this victorious music and feeling very proud of themselves, and rules in particular. And it's just a big show of force. It doesn't actually demonstrate anything in terms of their real power or whether they've understood anything about the scenario. It's just a show for the cameras.
Yeah,
and to make themselves feel better, to justify their own existence and their own sort of purpose, which, despite everything, we can understand they all want to do. So,
yeah, definitely. And I feel also with season 3, I think if you were a first-time viewer and you gave up in season 2 or at the end of season 2, you wouldn't really understand what the show could achieve or what it's about properly. I think if you gave up at the end of season 3, you would know that there's some point during halfway in the season that the show kind of realizes itself. It becomes about the city rather than about the police or about the drug dealers or about the politicians. And particularly in this final couple of episodes, we see how everything is just a big interlinked city web. And the show really does finally get to the point where it's built itself up enough to become about that rather than about certain individuals like Frank Sobotka or McNulty. And it's now just this big city portrait that continues to expand throughout the next 2 seasons. So I think there's certainly a big thing to say about that in terms of the way season 3 grows the show.
Yeah, you're right. It opens it out an awful lot. I think if you gave up at the end of season 3, then
you'd be stupid.
There's no hope for you, I'm afraid. There's just no hope for you.
Yeah. Because giving up at the end of 2 is a feasible thing. I'm sure people would perhaps want to do that because, as we've said, the show hasn't quite explained itself enough yet by that point.
And finally, I just wanted to mention that when you have a series of a TV show like this where it's presenting a radical idea like Amsterdam, having these free zones, or certainly radical in the kind of the sense of it being introduced to a predominantly American audience, and how they can solve these problems in their cities, it would have been very easy for the show to try and press this idea on people, and to have quite an ideological slant, to have a bias, and to be like, look, we can solve all the problems doing this. But it does not do that at all. At no point does The Wire kind of fall into the trap of trying to present easy answers to any of these problems. And it's very satisfying to see it done in that manner, and to show just how complex the situation is, and that there are no easy answers.
Yeah. No, definitely. It's very much there just to display problems and not to preach whatsoever. It tries very hard to steer away from that, which makes it all the more amazing for us to break down. There's so many more ways to read it when someone's kind of opinions and fingerprints are all over the dialogue and the way things are portrayed.
Yeah.
So that's something that really works to the show's strength and makes it very, very journalistic, or certainly of a pure journalism. And I think also it's worth mentioning that the whole Hamsterdam thing, I know that there is a discussion regarding whether Hamsterdam is more outrageous than the newspaper stuff that goes on in season 5. They're often considered to be the show's 2 big arcs that perhaps stretch disbelief too much, or suspension of disbelief too much. I think the season 5 newspaper storyline generally gets a little bit more flack, but I mean, I generally do think it's pretty difficult to imagine whole districts of a city staying unchecked like this, for a good few weeks, and it's not until the newspapers are called that someone does come and find it. But yeah, it's certainly worth sort of making people, sort of bringing up that idea of things being a little bit too absurd.
It's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, American cities are big. I mean, they're big places, and they're obviously demonstrating that these are fairly these are meant to be unchecked areas. I mean, they're abandoned. They're not assumed to have anything in them. So, I don't know. I guess it's not entirely unfeasible without knowing more about Baltimore as a city and about the likelihood of these things being checked. It's hard to say for certain. I don't think... I mean, having watched it quite a few times, I've never really felt like I had to really, extend my sense of... my suspension of disbelief in order to enjoy watching it. I never really found myself having to do that, but I guess I can see why you could raise points against it and say this such and such doesn't quite make sense. This isn't particularly realistic, but as TV shows go, I think The Wire does a pretty good job of making it seem believable.
No, definitely. All right.
So let's take a quick look at our last few sections then.
Don't matter who did what to who at this point. Fact is, we went to war, and now there ain't no going back. I mean, shit, it's what war is, you know? Once you in it, you in it. If it's a lie, then we fight on that lie. But we gotta fight.
Every single character was in this episode by the looks of it.
Yeah.
Apart from Landsman, perhaps. I can't think of anyone else who was missing.
He's mentioned.
Who are your favourites? He's mentioned, so we can put him in there for honorary purposes. I think perhaps Bunny, McNulty, Burrell, and Carcetti stood out, but it's a very, very pointless process to even begin singling people out because everyone.
Yeah, who are my favourites? Yeah, it's this is a kind of impossible task for a finale like this, where there is a huge ensemble emphasis, especially in these finales. I think it's been a very uplifting season as a whole for Cutty. Really, really good performance. And just a very enjoyable character as a whole. To see him have that rise and to learn from his mistakes and kind of become more of a mentor. We're used to seeing a lot of characters in a position where they already are mentoring people and they already are an established, wise figure, whereas with Cutty, we kind of see his rise into that position instead, which is nice. It's good to see Daniel's in a position of comfort, and the fact that him and his relationship with Pullman has kind of come such a long way. That's a very enjoyable part of it as well. I really like what is essentially the send-off from their positions, and we see so many of them. We see McNulty sending off, which is really nicely done. I really enjoy that. I really like the small one that we have with Prez. It's very heartfelt. We see him moving on to the teaching.
Yeah.
I mean, Wood Harris continues to be absolutely stunning as Avon Barksdale, and it is kind of a shame that we don't really see him again until season 5. So,
yeah.
I mean, there's just too many to list individually.
I mean, it's perhaps ideal to call Stringer the character of the season, perhaps. I mean, in many ways, it's his season.
Yeah, there's so much emphasis on him that it's very difficult not to see it that way, and it is very much his rise and fall.
Yeah. Yeah, building a lot on what we saw of him in the first 2 seasons and really focusing heavily on the outcome of all that stuff in this season in a very, very satisfying way. So, yeah. That's as far as the characters go. In terms of scenes, again, there's so many good ones that the episode just sort of flits between things so quickly. There's just very hard to look at this episode as a series of chapters, I think, isn't it, really? Because every institution is so intertwined with the ones next to it now that we can't even begin to categorize some of it. And it creates for scenes that just are much more interesting and wide-reaching. Perhaps some of the scenes of the season would be a better one to look into.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, hard to really point one out for this episode alone. How do you rate the montage?
Really good, actually.
Amongst the other montages of the show.
Yeah, very enjoyable. I think the montage music is, completely amazing for all the seasons. The Fast Train song, Solomon Burke, very, very good. Really elicits that emotion that you're after. In terms of the best montage, they're all different, but they're all very similar.
Yeah. They all
I don't
emphasise
really
that more things change, more they stay the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's nice to see these characters that you've grown to love and know and love, and sort of vaguely in slow motion to the backdrop of music, sort of just moving on with their lives. There's always going to be a satisfaction in watching that, particularly with McNulty enjoying his beat on the street so far, sort of getting to know the community, as per mentioned by some of the residents of the street, that's what they want from their police now. So that was sort of one of the more heartwarming elements of it. But I think they're all very much of a muchness, if that makes sense. And perhaps the fifth one is the most hard hitting because it really does bring us full circle. I know we get some footage from the low rises and the rest of it, bringing us right back round. So
well, that's a real complete finale, isn't it? So that's a sort of a thing in its own right.
It deserves to be the best one. But yeah.
So quickly then, let's have a look at the title, Mission Accomplished. And we mentioned already that this is most obviously tying into our War on Terror / War in Iraq. Obviously, we had George Bush announcing what was supposedly the end of the war in Iraq on that big aircraft carrier with a big banner behind him saying Mission Accomplished, even though it's complete rubbish. It wasn't the end of anything, really. And I guess we're tying into a lot of, completed missions here. We have McNulty and the detail or the major case unit kind of defeating the Barksdale organisation to some extent, even though it is a bit of a hollow victory. I suppose we have Cutty having a bit of a mission having been accomplished. He's now established his community gym, so that's good for him. But I guess there's also the false nature of announcing success that will come from them dismantling Hamsterdam, because they're announcing a certain end of some war there, but it's not. And the language that, say, Carcetti, for example, is using indicates that the desire for there to be this conflict and the desire to keep this imagined fight ongoing, it shows that it's not the end of anything. We're just moving on to the next phase or the next chapter in what seems to be an endless war on drugs, and that kind of war on terror and war on drugs is they're showing in parallel that they are perpetual, and that there's kind of nothing that can be done to change it at present because of the cyclical nature and the way that people are protecting themselves, and that, as it ties in with the epigraph, even if they are aware that what they're doing it for is all the wrong reasons and that they're basing it on lies, they have to keep going in order to save face and to not waste everything that they've put into it thus far. So the mission accomplished is just a kind of sarcastic title playing on what we've seen from the war in Iraq analogy, and how, despite there are some successes in this season even, that we also see a lot of false victories being announced. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it, really.
Yeah, very good. There's a lot to sort of draw from the title this time around, isn't there? Pretty much mirror yours. I guess if you look at it as an ironic title, you can look at it a bit more literally in the context of the montage, how the names have changed, but the actions stay the same. And despite at least 4 or 5 different attempts at reform over the whole season, we're back exactly where we started. So mission unaccomplished, certainly. And you could apply that to so many characters who are going through a transition between 3 and 4 here. They've accomplished something. Prez, in some ways, has had a victory. He's using this to find something that he's better suited to. Stringer's death has incited Barksdale-Stanfield violence. In some ways, that's a mission accomplished. There's all sorts you could tie it to, really. And perhaps just the notion of a general end of season. It could be as simple as that. Season 3 is finished, mission accomplished. Particularly as, the showrunners did not know whether the show would continue. This could have been the final episode. They had no idea. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, at the time they weren't sure, because there's quite a big gap between 3 and 4, I think. So.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's nowhere near as fitting as an ending as the season 5 ending, but there are elements of it that really would have been quite satisfying. It would have made for a much more hopeful McNulty finish. In many ways, it would have actually been perhaps too sweet. But of course, there is a lot of destruction that happens as well. So it's an interesting perspective to think about it from anyway, that this could have been the end of the show.
And this all ties nicely into our epigraph as well, about Slim Charles saying, we fight on that lie. As we already mentioned, this is we have our reference for the war in Iraq, most notably the supposed weapons of mass destruction that, unsurprisingly, were never found, and they were kind of fighting on the lie, and in the same way we have the Barksdale organisation doing the same thing. They have to finish it now that they started it.
Yep, doesn't matter what you're fighting for, doesn't matter how your intentions have changed, you're fighting, so you got to finish it. Yeah, absolutely. And just on the absolutely note, I guess we can officially designate that as the show catchphrase.
I don't know if we did. We mention it in the last episode. I don't know if we did.
No, we haven't mentioned it at all. Actually,
one of the comments that our dedicated YouTube commenter Kevin has made is about the catchphrases in the show, and he mentions obviously McNulty. What the fuck did I do? We have Bunk. Are you happy now, bitch? We have. I suppose you have. I don't know if you mentioned Clay Davis, but we have Clay Davis's the most unique way of saying the word shit ever. There was another one as well, wasn't there? Omar, about it all being in the game. And then
all in the game, yeah.
Our very own Toby Huntingford.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, it's not going to stop.
Yeah, I'm glad that it's not made you self-conscious of saying the word at all.
I'm getting caught up in the wire. I can't really think about how conscious my language is.
If you are absolute with your agreement in something, then it's perfectly reasonable for you to say that. I'm fine with it. I don't have a problem with it.
Excellent. No, we agree on most things in the show, so I think it's a fairly fitting word for most of our discussions.
But otherwise, a very sort of astute and humorous observation by Kevin, so that was funny.
That was a really good comment. It certainly tickled me.
So that brings us to a close. That's the end of Season 3. The next episode that we'll be doing will be starting Season 4. Can't believe it. It will be happening next week as well. No plans for any breaks or anything like that. Let's keep on pushing ahead.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for joining us again for another season. We shall see you at the start of Season 4 next week. If you've got any comments or thoughts about Season 3 in general, or anything that we've said in this episode or any of the other episodes thus far, then you can contact us on the website at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com. There's a contact page on there. A couple of people have been commenting on the blog posts as well. Take a look at the stuff on there. We've posted a few little bits here and there about what's happening with the podcast and if we've been featured anywhere, and any links that we get sent from viewers. We usually post them up on there. You can also send us a direct email to caughtonthewire@gmail.com. And just leaves me to say thanks again for joining us.